Chapter 21. Suspense. In his memorable interview with Robespierre, the day before he left for England, Chauvelin had asked that absolute power be given him, in order that he might carry out the plans for the capture of the Scarlet Pimpernel, which he had in his mind. Now that he was back in France, he had no cause to complain that the revolutionary government had grudged him this power for which he had asked. Implicit obedience had followed whenever he had commanded. As soon as he heard that a woman had been arrested in the act of uttering a passport in the name of Céline Dumont, he guessed at once that Marguerite Blakeney had, with characteristic impulse, fallen into the trap which, with the aid of the woman candle, he had succeeded in laying for her. He was not the least surprised at that. He knew human nature, feminine nature, far too well, ever to have been in doubt for a moment that Marguerite would follow her husband without calculating either costs or risks. Ye gods! The irony of it all. Had she not been called the cleverest woman in Europe at one time? Chauvelin himself had thus acclaimed her, in those olden days, before she and he became such mortal enemies, and when he was one of the many satellites that revolved round brilliant Marguerite St. And tonight, when a sergeant of the town guards brought him news of her capture, he smiled grimly to himself. The cleverest woman in Europe had failed to perceive the trap laid temptingly open for her. Once more she had betrayed her husband into the hands of those who would not let him escape a second time. And now she had done it with her eyes open, with loving, passionate heart which ached for self-sacrifice, and only succeeded in imperiling the loved one more hopelessly than before. The sergeant was waiting for orders. Citizen Chauvelin had come to Boulogne, armed with more full and more autocratic powers than any servant of the new republic had ever been endowed with before. The governor of the town, the captain of the guard, the fort and municipality were all as abject slaves before him. As soon as he had taken possession of the quarters organized for him in the town hall, he had asked for a list of prisoners who for one cause or another were being detained pending further investigations. The list was long and contained many names which were of not the slightest interest to Chauvelin. He passed them over impatiently. To be released at once, he said curtly. He did not want the guard to be burdened with unnecessary duties, nor the prisons of the little seaport town to be inconveniently encumbered. He wanted room, space, air, the force and intelligence of the entire town at his command for the one capture which meant life and revenge to him. A woman, name unknown, found in possession of a forged passport in the name of Céline Dumont, made to the citizens Désirée Candle, attempted to land, was interrogated and failed to give satisfactory explanation of herself, detained in room number 6 of the Gaol prison. This was one of the last names on the list, the only one of any importance to citizen Chauvelin. When he read it he nearly drove his nails into the palms of his hands, so desperate an effort did he make not to betray before the sergeant by look or sigh the exultation which he felt. For a moment he shaded his eyes against the glare of the lamp, but it was not long before he had formulated a plan and was ready to give his orders. He asked for a list of prisoners already detained in the various forts. The name of l'Abbé Fouquet with those of his niece and nephew attracted his immediate attention. He asked for further information respecting these people, heard that the boy was a widow's only son, the sole supporter of his mother's declining years. The girl was ailing, suffering from incipient phthisis, and was blind. Party. The very thing. Lab himself, the friend of Juliette Marny, the pathetic personality around which this final adventure of the Scarlet Pimpernel was intended to revolve. And these two young people. His sister's children. One of them blind and ill, the other full of vigor and manhood. Citizen Chauvelin had soon made up his mind. A few quick orders to the sergeant of the guard, and l'Abbé Fouquet, weak, helpless and gentle, became the relentless jailer who would guard Marguerite more securely than a whole regiment of loyal soldiers could have done. Then, having dispatched a messenger to the Committee of Public Safety, Chauvelin laid himself down to rest. Fate had not deceived him. He had thought and schemed and planned, and events had shaped themselves exactly as foreseen, and the fact that Marguerite Blakeney was at the present moment a prisoner in his hands was merely the result of his own calculations. As for the Scarlet Pimpernel, Chauvelin could not very well conceive what he would do under these present circumstances. The duel on the southern ramparts had of course become a farce, not likely to be enacted now that Marguerite's life was at stake. The daring adventurer was caught in a network at last, from which all his ingenuity, all his wit, his impudence and his amazing luck could never extricate him. And in Chauvelin's mind there was still something more. Revenge was the sweetest emotion his bruised and humbled pride could know. He had not yet tasted its complete intoxicating joy, but every hour now his cup of delight became more and more full. In a few days it would overflow. In the meanwhile he was content to wait. The hours sped by and there was no news yet of that elusive Pimpernel. Of Marguerite he knew nothing save that she was well guarded. The sentry who passed up and down outside room number 6 had heard her voice and that of the Abbé Fouquet in the course of the afternoon. Chauvelin had asked the Committee of Public Safety for aid in his difficult task, but 48 hours at least must elapse before such aid could reach him. 48 hours, during which the hand of an assassin might be lurking for him, and might even reach him ere his vengeance was fully accomplished. That was the only thought which really troubled him. He did not want to die before he had seen the Scarlet Pimpernel, a withered abject creature, crushed in fame and honor, too debased to find glorification even in death. At this moment he only cared for his life because it was needed for the complete success of his schemes. No one else he knew would have that note of personal hatred towards the enemy of France which was necessary now in order to carry out successfully the plans which he had formed. Robespierre and all the others only desired the destruction of a man who had intrigued against the reign of terror which they had established. His death on the guillotine, even if it were surrounded with the halo of martyrdom, would have satisfied them completely. Chauvelin looked further than that. He hated the man. He had suffered humiliation through him individually. He wished to see him as an object of contempt rather than of pity. And because of the anticipation of this joy, he was careful of his life, and throughout those 2 days which elapsed between the capture of Marguerite and the arrival of Collot de Herbois at Boulogne, Chauvelin never left his quarters at the Hôtel de Ville, and requisitioned a special escort consisting of proved soldiers of the town guard to attend his every footstep. On the evening of the 22nd, after the arrival of Citizen Collot in Boulogne, he gave orders that the woman from number 6 cell be brought before him in the ground floor room of the Fort Gayole. Chapter 22. Not Death. 2 days of agonizing suspense, of alternate hope and despair, had told heavily on Marguerite Blakeney. Her courage was still indomitable, her purpose firm and her faith secure, but she was without the slightest vestige of news, entirely shut off from the outside world, left to conjecture, to scheme, to expect and to despond alone. The Abbé Fouquet had tried in his gentle way to be of comfort to her, and she in her turn did her very best not to render his position more cruel than it already was. A message came to him twice during those 48 hours from François and Félicite, a little note scribbled by the boy, or a token sent by the blind girl, to tell the abbé that the children were safe and well, that they would be safe and well so long as the citizens with the name unknown remained closely guarded by him in room number 6. When these messages came, the old man would sigh and murmur something about the good God, and hope, which perhaps had faintly risen in Marguerite's heart within the last hour or so, would once more sink back into the abyss of uttermost despair. Outside, the monotonous walk of the sentries sounded like the perpetual thud of a hammer beating upon her bruised temples. What's to be done? My God? What's to be done? Where was Percy now? How to reach him? Oh God, grant me light. The one real terror which she felt was that she would go mad. That she was in a measure mad already. For hours now, or was it days? Or years? She had heard nothing save that rhythmic walk of the sentinel, and the kindly, tremulous voice of the abbé whispering consolations, or murmuring prayers in her ears. She had seen nothing save that prison door, of rough deal, painted a dull gray with great old-fashioned lock and hinges rusty with the damp of ages. She had kept her eyes fixed on that door until they burned and ached with well-nigh intolerable pain. Yet she felt that she could not look elsewhere, lest she missed the golden moment when the bolts would be drawn, and that dull gray door would swing slowly on its rusty hinges. Surely, surely that was the commencement of madness. Yet for Percy's sake, because he might want her, because he might have need of her courage and of her presence of mind, she tried to keep her wits about her. But it was difficult. Terribly difficult. Especially when the shade of evening began to gather in, and peopled the squalid, whitewashed room with innumerable threatening ghouls. Then when the moon came up, a silver ray crept in through the tiny window and struck full upon that gray door, making it look weird and spectral like the entrance to a house of ghosts. Even now, as there was a distinct sound of the pushing of bolts and bars, Marguerite thought that she was the prey of hallucinations. The Abbé Fouquet was sitting in the remote and darkest corner of the room, quietly telling his beads. His serene philosophy and gentle placidity could in no way be disturbed by the opening or shutting of a door, or by the bearer of good or evil tidings. The room now seemed strangely gloomy and cavernous, with those deep black shadows all around and that white ray of the moon which struck so weirdly on the door. Marguerite shuddered with one of those unaccountable premonitions of something evil about to come, which ofttimes assail those who have a nervous and passionate temperament. The door swung slowly open upon its hinges. There was a quick word of command, and the light of a small oil lamp struck full into the gloom. Vaguely Marguerite discerned a group of men, soldiers no doubt, for there was a glint of arms and the suggestion of tricolor cockades and scarves. One of the men was holding the lamp aloft, another took a few steps forward into the room. He turned to Marguerite, entirely ignoring the presence of the old priest, and addressed her peremptorily. "Your presence is desired by the citizen governor," he said curtly. "Stand up and follow me." "Whither am I to go?" she asked. "To where my men will take you." "Now then," quicks the word. The citizen governor does not like to wait. At a word of command from him, 2 more soldiers now entered the room and placed themselves one on each side of Marguerite, who, knowing that resistance was useless, had already risen and was prepared to go. The abbé tried to utter a word of protest and came quickly forward towards Marguerite, but he was summarily and very roughly pushed aside. "Now then, Calatin," said the first soldier with an oath, "this is none of your business. Forward. March," he added, addressing his men, "and you, Citizeness, will find it wiser to come quietly along and not to attempt any tricks with me, or the gag and manacles will have to be used." But Marguerite had no intention of resisting. She was too tired even to wonder as to what they meant to do with her or whither they were going. She moved as in a dream and felt a hope within her that she was being led to death. Summary executions were the order of the day, she knew that, and sighed for this simple solution of the awful problem which had been harassing her these past 2 days. She was being led along a passage, stumbling ever and anon as she walked, for it was but dimly lighted by the same little oil lamp, which one of the soldiers was carrying in front, holding it high up above his head. Then they went down a narrow flight of stone steps, until she and her escort reached a heavy oak door. A halt was ordered at this point, and the man in command of the little party pushed the door open and walked in. Marguerite caught sight of a room beyond, dark and gloomy looking, as was her own prison cell. Somewhere on the left there was obviously a window. She could not see it but guessed that it was there because the moon struck full upon the floor, ghost-like and spectral, well fitting in with the dreamlike state in which Marguerite felt herself to be. In the center of the room she could discern a table with a chair close beside it, also a couple of tallow candles, which flickered in the draught caused no doubt by that open window which she could not see. All these little details impressed themselves on Marguerite's mind, as she stood there, placidly waiting until she should once more be told to move along. The table, the chair, that unseen window, trivial objects though they were, assumed before her overwrought fancy an utterly disproportionate importance. She caught herself presently counting up the number of boards visible on the floor, and watching the smoke of the tallow candles rising up towards the grimy ceiling. After a few minutes' weary waiting which seemed endless to Marguerite, there came a short word of command from within and she was roughly pushed forward into the room by one of the men. The cool air of a late September's evening gently fanned her burning temples. She looked round her and now perceived that someone was sitting at the table, the other side of the tallow candles, a man with head bent over a bundle of papers and shading his face against the light with his hand. He rose as she approached, and the flickering flame of the candles played weirdly upon the slight, sable-clad figure, illumining the keen, ferret-like face, and throwing fitful gleams across the deep-set eyes and the narrow, cruel mouth. It was Chauvelin. Mechanically Marguerite took the chair which the soldier drew towards her, ordering her curtly to sit down. She seemed to have but little power to move. Though all her faculties had suddenly become preternaturally alert at sight of this man, whose very life now was spent in doing her the most grievous wrong that one human being can do to another, yet all these faculties were forcefully centered in the one mighty effort not to flinch before him, not to let him see for a moment that she was afraid. She compelled her eyes to look at him fully and squarely, her lips not to tremble, her very heart to stop its wild, excited beating. She felt his keen eyes fixed intently upon her, but more in curiosity than in hatred or satisfied vengeance. When she had sat down he came round the table and moved towards her. When he drew quite near, she instinctively recoiled. It had been an almost imperceptible action on her part and certainly an involuntary one, for she did not wish to betray a single thought or emotion, until she knew what he wished to say. But he had noted her movement, a sort of drawing up and stiffening of her whole person as he approached. He seemed pleased to see it, for he smiled sarcastically but with evident satisfaction, and, as if his purpose was now accomplished, he immediately withdrew and went back to his former seat on the other side of the table. After that he ordered the soldiers to go. "But remain at attention outside, you and your men," he added, "ready to enter if I call." It was Marguerite's turn to smile at this obvious sign of a lurking fear on Chauvelin's part, and a line of sarcasm and contempt curled her full lips. The soldiers having obeyed and the oak door having closed upon them, Marguerite was now alone with the man whom she hated and loathed beyond every living thing on earth. She wondered when he would begin to speak and why he had sent for her. But he seemed in no hurry to begin. Still shading his face with his hand, he was watching her with utmost attention. She, on the other hand, was looking through and beyond him, with contemptuous indifference, as if his presence here did not interest her in the least. She would give him no opening for this conversation which he had sought and which she felt would prove either purposeless or else deeply wounding to her heart and to her pride. She sat therefore quite still with the flickering and yellow light fully illumining her delicate face, with its childlike curves and delicate features, the noble, straight brow, the great blue eyes and halo of golden hair. "My desire to see you here tonight must seem strange to you, Lady Blakeney," said Chauvelin at last. Then, as she did not reply, he continued, speaking quite gently, almost deferentially. "There are various matters of grave importance, which the events of the next 24 hours will reveal to your ladyship, and believe me that I am actuated by motives of pure friendship towards you in this my effort to mitigate the unpleasantness of such news as you might hear tomorrow perhaps, by giving you due warning of what its nature might be." She turned great questioning eyes upon him, and in their expression she tried to put all the contempt which she felt, all the bitterness, all the defiance and the pride. He quietly shrugged his shoulders. "I fear me," he said, "that your ladyship as usual doth me grievous wrong. It is but natural that you should misjudge me, yet believe me—" "A truce on this foolery, M. Chauvelin," she broke in, with sudden impatient vehemence. "Pray leave your protestations of friendship and courtesy alone, there is no one here to hear them. I pray you proceed with what you have to say." "Ah!" It was a sigh of satisfaction on the part of Chauvelin. Her anger and impatience even at this early stage of the interview proved sufficiently that her icy restraint was only on the surface. And Chauvelin always knew how to deal with vehemence. He loved to play with the emotions of a passionate fellow creature. It was only the imperturbable calm of a certain enemy of his that was wont to shake his own impenetrable armor of reserve. "As your ladyship desires," he said, with a slight and ironical bow of the head. "But before proceeding according to your wish, I am compelled to ask your ladyship just one question. And that is, have you reflected what your present position means to that inimitable prince of dandies, Sir Percy Blakeney? Is it necessary for your present purpose, monsieur, that you should mention my husband's name at all?" she asked. "It is indispensable, fair lady," he replied suavely, "for is not the fate of your husband so closely intertwined with yours, that his actions will inevitably be largely influenced by your own?" Marguerite gave a start of surprise, and as Chauvelin had paused she tried to read what hidden meaning lay behind these last words of his. Was it his intention then to propose some bargain, one of those terrible either-ors, of which he seemed to possess the malignant secret? If that was so, if indeed he had sent for her in order to suggest one of those terrible alternatives of his, then, be it what it may, be it the wildest conception which the insane brain of a fiend could invent, she would accept it, so long as the man she loved were given one single chance of escape. Therefore she turned to her arch-enemy in a more conciliatory spirit now, and even endeavored to match her own diplomatic cunning against his. "I do not understand," she said tentatively. "How can my actions influence those of my husband? I am a prisoner in Boulogne. He probably is not aware of that fact yet and—" "Sir Percy Blakeney may be in Boulogne at any moment now," he interrupted quietly. "And I mistake not, few places can offer such great attractions to that peerless gentleman of fashion than doth this humble provincial town of France just at this present. Hath it not the honor of harboring Lady Blakeney within its gates? And your ladyship may indeed believe me when I say that the day that Sir Percy lands in our hospitable port, 200 pairs of eyes will be fixed upon him, lest he should wish to quit it again. And if there were 2,000, sir," she said impulsively, "they would not stop his coming or going as he pleased. Nay, fair lady," he said with a smile, "are you then endowing Sir Percy Blakeney with the attributes which, as popular fancy has it, belong exclusively to that mysterious English hero, the Scarlet Pimpernel?" "A truce to your diplomacy, Monsieur Chauvelin," she retorted, goaded by his sarcasm. "Why should we try to fence with one another? What was the object of your journey to England? Of the farce which you enacted in my house, with the help of the woman Candle? Of that duel and that challenge, save that you desired to entice Sir Percy Blakeney to France? And also his charming wife," he added with an ironical bow. She bit her lip and made no comment. "Shall we say that I succeeded admirably?" he continued, speaking with persistent urbanity and calm, "and that I have strong cause to hope that the elusive Pimpernel will soon be a guest on our friendly shores? There. You see I too have laid down the foils. As you say, why should we fence? Your ladyship is now in Boulogne, soon Sir Percy will come to try and take you away from us, But believe me, fair lady, that it would take more than the ingenuity and the daring of the Scarlet Pimpernel magnified 1,000-fold to get him back to England again, unless... Marguerite held her breath. She felt now as if the whole universe must stand still during the next supreme moment, until she had heard what Chauvelin's next words would be. There was to be an unless, then? And either or more terrible no doubt than the one he had formulated before her just a year ago. Chauvelin, she knew, was past master in the art of putting a knife at his victim's throat and of giving it just the necessary twist with his cruel and relentless unless. But she felt quite calm because her purpose was resolute. There is no doubt that during this agonizing moment of suspense she was absolutely firm in her determination to accept any and every condition which Chauvelin would put before her as the price of her husband's safety. After all, these conditions, since he placed them before her, could resolve themselves into questions of her own life against her husband's. With that unreasoning impulse which was one of her most salient characteristics, she never paused to think that, to Chauvelin, her own life or death were only the means to the great end which he had in view, the complete annihilation of the Scarlet Pimpernel. That end could only be reached by Percy Blakeney's death, not by her own. Even now, as she was watching him with eyes glowing and lips tightly closed, lest a cry of impatient agony should escape her throat, he, like a snail that has shown its slimy horns too soon, and is not ready to face the enemy as yet, seemed suddenly to withdraw within his former shell of careless suavity. The earnestness of his tone vanished, giving place to light and easy conversation, just as if he were discussing social topics with a woman of fashion in a Paris drawing-room. "Nay," he said pleasantly, "is not your ladyship taking this matter in too serious a spirit? Of a truth you repeated my innocent word, unless, even as if I were putting knife at your dainty throat. Yet I meant not that need disturb you yet. Have I not said that I am your friend? Let me try and prove it to you." "You will find that a difficult task, monsieur," she said drily. "Difficult tasks always have had a great fascination for your humble servant. May I try?" "Certainly. Shall we then touch at the root of this delicate matter? Your ladyship, so I understand, is at this moment under the impression that I desire to encompass, shall I say, the death of an English gentleman for whom, believe me, I have the greatest respect. That is so, is it not?" "What is so, M. Chauvelin?" she asked almost stupidly, for truly she had not even begun to grasp his meaning. "I do not understand. You think that I am at this moment taking measures for sending the Scarlet Pimpernel to the guillotine?" "I do. Never was so great an error committed by a clever woman. Your ladyship must believe me when I say that the guillotine is the very last place in the world where I would wish to see that enigmatic and elusive personage. Are you trying to fool me, M. Chauvelin? So, for what purpose? And why do you lie to me like that?" "On my honor, 'tis the truth. The death of Sir Percy Blakeney, I may call him that, may I not? Would ill suit the purpose which I have in view." "What purpose?" "You must pardon me, Monsieur Chauvelin," she added with a quick, impatient sigh, "but of a truth I am getting confused, and my wits must have become dull in the past few days. I pray to you to add to your many protestations of friendship a little more clearness in your speech and, if possible, a little more brevity. What then is the purpose which you had in view when you enticed my husband to come over to France?" "My purpose was the destruction of the Scarlet Pimpernel, not the death of Sir Percy Blakeney. Believe me, I have a great regard for Sir Percy. He is a most accomplished gentleman, witty, brilliant, an inimitable dandy. Why should he not grace with his presence the drawing-rooms of London or of Brighton for many years to come?" She looked at him with puzzled inquiry. For one moment the thought flashed through her mind that, after all, Chauvelin might be still in doubt as to the identity of the Scarlet Pimpernel. But no, that hope was madness. It was preposterous and impossible. But then why? Why? Oh God, for a little more patience. "What I have just said may seem a little enigmatic to your ladyship," he continued blandly, "but surely so clever a woman as yourself, so great a lady as is the wife of Sir Percy Blakeney, Baronet, will be aware that there are other means of destroying an enemy than the taking of his life. For instance, Monsieur Chauvelin? There is the destruction of his honor," he replied slowly. A long, bitter laugh, almost hysterical in its loud outburst, broke from the very depths of Marguerite's convulsed heart. "The destruction of his honor? Of a truth, Monsieur Chauvelin, your inventive powers have led you beyond the bounds of dreamland. It is in the land of madness that you are wandering, sir, when you talk in one breath of Sir Percy Blakeney and the possible destruction of his honor." But he remained apparently quite unruffled, and when her laughter had somewhat subsided, he said placidly, Perhaps. Then he rose from his chair and once more approached her. This time she did not shrink from him. The suggestion which he had made just now, this talk of attacking her husband's honor rather than his life, seemed so wild and preposterous, the conception truly of a mind unhinged, that she looked upon it as a sign of extreme weakness on his part, almost as an acknowledgment of impotence. But she watched him as he moved round the table more in curiosity now than in fright. He puzzled her, and she still had a feeling at the back of her mind that there must be something more definite and more evil lurking at the back of that tortuous brain. "Will your ladyship allow me to conduct you to yonder window?" he said. "The air is cool, and what I have to say can best be done in sight of yonder sleeping city." His tone was one of perfect courtesy, even of respectful deference through which not the slightest trace of sarcasm could be discerned, and she, still actuated by curiosity and interest, not in any way by fear, quietly rose to obey him. Though she ignored the hand which he was holding out towards her, she followed him readily enough as he walked up to the window. All through this agonizing and soul-stirring interview she had felt heavily oppressed by the close atmosphere of the room, rendered nauseous by the evil smell of the smoky tallow candles which were left to spread their grease and smoke abroad unchecked. Once or twice she had gazed longingly towards the suggestion of pure air outside. Chauvelin evidently had still much to say to her. The torturing mental rack to which she was being subjected had not yet fully done its work. It still was capable of one or two turns, a twist or so which might succeed in crushing her pride and her defiance. Well, so be it. She was in the man's power, had placed herself therein through her own unreasoning impulse. This interview was but one of the many soul agonies which she had been called upon to endure, and if by submitting to it all she could in a measure mitigate her own faults and be of help to the man she loved, she would find the sacrifice small and the mental torture easy to bear. Therefore when Chauvelin beckoned to her to draw near, she went up to the window, and leaning her head against the deep stone embrasure, she looked out into the night. Chapter 23 The Hostage. Chauvelin, without speaking, extended his hand out towards the city as if to invite Marguerite to gaze upon it. She was quite unconscious what hour of the night it might be, but it must have been late, for the little town, encircled by the stony arms of its forts, seemed asleep. The moon, now slowly sinking in the west, edged the towers and spires with filmy lines of silver. To the right Marguerite caught sight of the frowning Beffroi, which even as she gazed out began tolling its heavy bell. It sounded like the tocsin, dull and muffled. After 10 strokes it was still. 10 o'clock. At this hour in far-off England, in fashionable London, the play was just over. Crowds of gaily dressed men and women poured out of the open gates of the theaters calling loudly for attendant or chaise. Thence to balls or routs, gaily fluttering like so many butterflies, brilliant and irresponsible. And in England also, in the beautiful gardens of her Richmond home, ofttimes at 10 o'clock she had wandered alone with Percy, when he was at home, and the spirit of adventure in him momentarily laid to rest. Then, when the night was very dark and the air heavy with the scent of roses and lilies, she lay quiescent in his arms in that little arbor beside the river. The rhythmic lapping of the waves was the only sound that stirred the balmy air. He seldom spoke then, for his voice would shake whenever he uttered a word, but his impenetrable armor of flippancy was pierced through and he did not speak because his lips were pressed to hers, and his love had soared beyond the domain of speech. A shudder of intense mental pain went through her now as she gazed on the sleeping city, and sweet memories of the past turned to bitterness in this agonizing present. One by one as the moon gradually disappeared behind a bank of clouds, the towers of Boulogne were merged in the gloom. In front of her far, far away beyond the flat sand dunes, the sea seemed to be calling to her with a ghostly and melancholy moan. The window was on the ground floor of the fort, and gave direct onto the wide and shady walk which runs along the crest of the city walls. From where she stood Marguerite was looking straight along the ramparts, some 30 meters wide at this point, flanked on either side by the granite balustrade, and adorned with a double row of ancient elms stunted and twisted into grotesque shapes by the persistent action of the wind. "These wide ramparts are a peculiarity of this city," said a voice close to her ear. "At times of peace they form an agreeable promenade under the shade of the trees, and a delightful meeting place for lovers, or enemies." The sound brought her back to the ugly realities of the present. The rose-scented garden at Richmond, the lazily flowing river, the tender memories which for that brief moment had confronted her from out a happy past, suddenly vanished from her ken. Instead of these the brine-laden sea air struck her quivering nostrils, the echo of the old Beffroi died away in her ear, and now from out one of the streets or open places of the sleeping city there came the sound of a raucous voice, shooting in monotonous tones a string of words, the meaning of which failed to reach her brain. Not many feet below the window, the southern ramparts of the town stretched away into the darkness. She felt unaccountably cold suddenly as she looked down upon them and with aching eyes, tried to pierce the gloom. She was shivering in spite of the mildness of this early autumnal night. Her overwrought fancy was peopling the lonely walls with unearthly shapes strolling along, discussing in spectral language a strange duel which was to take place here between a noted butcher of men and a mad Englishman overfond of adventure. The ghouls seemed to pass and repass along in front of her and to be laughing audibly because that mad Englishman had been offered his life in exchange for his honor. They laughed and laughed, no doubt because he refused the bargain. Englishmen were always eccentric, and in these days of equality and other devices of a free and glorious revolution, honor was such a very marketable commodity that it seemed ridiculous to prize it quite so highly. Then they strolled away again and disappeared, whilst Marguerite distinctly heard the scrunching of the path beneath their feet. She leant forward to peer still further into the darkness, for this sound had seemed so absolutely real, but immediately a detaining hand was placed upon her arm and a sarcastic voice murmured at her elbow. "The result, fair lady, would only be a broken leg or arm. The height is not great enough for picturesque suicides, and believe me, these ramparts are only haunted by ghosts." She drew back as if a viper had stung her. For the moment she had become oblivious of Chauvelin's presence. However, she would not take notice of his taunt, and after a slight pause, he asked her if she could hear the town crier over in the public streets. "Yes," she replied. "What he says at this present moment is of vast importance to your ladyship," he remarked drily. "How so?" "Your ladyship is a precious hostage. We are taking measures to guard our valuable property securely." Marguerite thought of the Abbé Fouquet, who no doubt was still quietly telling his beads, even if in his heart he had begun to wonder what had become of her. She thought of François, who was the breadwinner, and of Félicite, who was blind. "Methinks you and your colleagues have done that already," she said. "Not as completely as we would wish. We know the daring of the Scarlet Pimpernel. We are not even ashamed to admit that we fear his luck, his impudence and his marvelous ingenuity. Have I not told you that I have the greatest possible respect for that mysterious English hero? An old priest and 2 young children might be spirited away by that enigmatical adventurer, even whilst Lady Blakeney herself is made to vanish from our sight. I see your ladyship is taking my simple words as a confession of weakness," he continued, noting the swift sigh of hope which had involuntarily escaped her lips. "Nay, and it please you, you shall despise me for it. But a confession of weakness is the first sign of strength. The Scarlet Pimpernel is still at large, and whilst we guard our hostage securely, he is bound to fall into our hands." "Still at large," she retorted with impulsive defiance. "Think you that all your bolts and bars, the ingenuity of yourself and your colleagues, the collaboration of the devil himself, would succeed in outwitting the Scarlet Pimpernel, now that his purpose will be to try and drag me from out your clutches?" She felt hopeful and proud. Now that she had the pure air of heaven in her lungs, that from afar she could smell the sea, and could feel that perhaps in a straight line of vision from where she stood, the Daydream, with Sir Percy on board, might be lying out there in the roads, it seemed impossible that he should fail in freeing her and those poor people, an old man and 2 children, whose lives depended on her own. But Chauvelin only laughed a dry, sarcastic laugh and said, "Perhaps not. It of course will depend on you and your personality, your feelings in such matters, and whether an English gentleman likes to save his own skin at the expense of others." Marguerite shivered as if from cold. "I see," resumed Chauvelin quietly, "that your ladyship has not quite grasped the position. That public crier is a long way off. The words have lingered on the evening breeze and have failed to reach your brain. Do you suppose that I and my colleagues do not know that all the ingenuity of which the Scarlet Pimpernel is capable will now be directed in piloting Lady Blakeney, and incidentally the Abbé Fouquet with his nephew and niece, safely across the channel? For people. A bagatelle for this mighty conspirator who but lately snatched 20 aristocrats from the prisons of lions? 2 children and an old man were not enough to guard our precious hostage, and I was not thinking of either the Abbé Fouquet or of the 2 children, when I said that an English gentleman would not save himself at the expense of others. Of whom then were you thinking, Monsieur Chauvelin? Whom else have you set to guard the prize which you value so highly?" "The whole city of Boulogne," he replied simply. "I do not understand. Let me make my point clear. My colleague, Citizen Collot de Herbois, rode over from Paris yesterday. Like myself, he is a member of the Committee of Public Safety whose duty it is to look after the welfare of France by punishing all those who conspire against her laws and the liberties of the people. Chief among these conspirators whom it is our duty to punish is, of course, that impudent adventurer who calls himself the Scarlet Pimpernel. He has given the government of France a great deal of trouble through his attempts, mostly successful as I have already admitted, at frustrating the just vengeance which an oppressed country has the right to wreak on those who have proved themselves to be tyrants and traitors. Is it necessary to recapitulate all this, Monsieur Chauvelin? She asked impatiently. I think so, he replied blandly. You see, my point is this. We feel that in a measure now the Scarlet Pimpernel is in our power. Within the next few hours he will land at Boulogne. Boulogne, where he has agreed to fight a duel with me. Boulogne, where Lady Blakeney happens to be at this present moment. As you see, Boulogne has a great responsibility to bear. Just now she is to a certain extent the proudest city in France, since she holds within her gates a hostage for the appearance on our shores of her country's most bitter enemy. But she must not fall from that high estate. Her double duty is clear before her. She must guard Lady Blakeney and capture the Scarlet Pimpernel. If she fail in the former she must be punished, if she succeed in the latter she shall be rewarded. He paused and leaned out of the window again, whilst she watched him, breathless and terrified. She was beginning to understand. Hark, he said, looking straight at her. Do you hear the crier now? He is proclaiming the punishment and the reward. He is making it clear to the citizens of Boulogne that on the day when the Scarlet Pimpernel falls into the hands of the Committee of Public Safety a general amnesty will be granted to all natives of Boulogne who are under arrest at the present time, and a free pardon to all those who, born within these city walls, are today under sentence of death. A noble reward, eh? Well deserved, you'll admit. Should you wonder then if the whole town of Boulogne were engaged just now in finding that mysterious hero, and delivering him into our hands? How many mothers, sisters, wives, think you at the present moment, would fail to lay hands on the English adventurer, if a husband's or a son's life or freedom happened to be at stake? I have some records there, he continued, pointing in the direction of the table, which tell me that there are 35 natives of Boulogne in the local prisons, a dozen more in the prisons of Paris. Of these at least 20 have been tried already and are condemned to death. Every hour that the Scarlet Pimpernel succeeds in evading his captors so many deaths lie at his door. If he succeeds in once more reaching England safely 60 lives mayhap will be the price of his escape. But I see your ladyship is shivering with cold. He added with a dry little laugh, shall I close the window? Or do you wish to hear what punishment will be meted out to Boulogne, if on the day that the Scarlet Pimpernel is captured, Lady Blakeney happens to have left the shelter of these city walls? I pray you proceed, monsieur, she rejoined with perfect calm. The Committee of Public Safety, he resumed, would look upon this city as a nest of traitors if on the day that the Scarlet Pimpernel becomes our prisoner Lady Blakeney herself, the wife of that notorious English spy, had already quitted Boulogne. The whole town knows by now that you are in our hands, you, the most precious hostage we can hold for the ultimate capture of the man whom we all fear and detest. Virtually the town crier is at the present moment proclaiming to the inhabitants of this city, we want that man, but we already have his wife. See to it, citizens, that she does not escape. For if she do, we shall summarily shoot the breadwinner in every family in the town. A cry of horror escaped Marguerite's parched lips. Are you devils then, all of you, she gasped, that you should think of such things? Why, some of us are devils, no doubt, said Chauvelin drily, but why should you honor us in this case with so flattering an epithet? We are mere men striving to guard our property and mean no harm to the citizens of Boulogne. We have threatened them, true. But is it not for you and that elusive Pimpernel to see that the threat is never put into execution? You would not do it, she repeated, horror-stricken. Nay, I pray you, fair lady, do not deceive yourself. At present the proclamation sounds like a mere threat, I'll allow, but let me assure you that if we fail to capture the Scarlet Pimpernel and if you on the other hand are spirited out of this fortress by that mysterious adventurer, we shall undoubtedly shoot or guillotine every able-bodied man and woman in this town. He had spoken quietly and emphatically, neither with bombast nor with rage, and Marguerite saw in his face nothing but a calm and ferocious determination, the determination of an entire nation embodied in this one man, to be revenged at any cost. She would not let him see the depth of her despair, nor would she let him read in her face the unutterable hopelessness which filled her soul. It were useless to make an appeal to him. She knew full well that from him she could obtain neither gentleness nor mercy. I hope at last I have made the situation quite clear to your ladyship? He was asking quite pleasantly now. See how easy is your position. You have but to remain quiescent in room number 6, and if any chance of escape be offered you ere the Scarlet Pimpernel is captured, you need but to think of all the families of Boulogne, who would be deprived of their breadwinner, fathers and sons mostly, but there are girls too who support their mothers or sisters. The fish curers of Boulogne are mostly women, and there are the net makers and the seamstresses. All would suffer if your ladyship were no longer to be found in number 6 room of this ancient fort, whilst all would be included in the amnesty if the Scarlet Pimpernel fell into our hands." He gave a low, satisfied chuckle which made Marguerite think of the evil spirits in hell exulting over the torments of unhappy lost souls. "I think, Lady Blakeney," he added drily and making her an ironical bow, "that your humble servant hath outwitted the elusive hero at last." Quietly he turned on his heel and went back into the room, Marguerite remaining motionless beside the open window, where the soft, brine-laden air, the distant murmur of the sea, the occasional cry of a seamew, all seemed to mock her agonizing despair. The voice of the town crier came nearer and nearer now. She could hear the words he spoke quite distinctly, something about amnesty and pardon, the reward for the capture of the Scarlet Pimpernel, the lives of men, women and children in exchange for his. She knew what all that meant. That Percy would not hesitate one single instant to throw his life into the hands of his enemies, in exchange for that of others. Others, others, always others. This sigh that had made her heart ache so often in England, what terrible significance it bore now, and how he would suffer in his heart and in his pride, because of her whom he could not even attempt to save, since it would mean the death of others. Of others, always of others. She wondered if he had already landed in Boulogne. Again she remembered the vision on the landing stage, his massive figure, the glimpse she had of the loved form in the midst of the crowd. The moment he entered the town he would hear the proclamation read, see it posted up no doubt on every public building, and realize that she had been foolish enough to follow him, that she was a prisoner and that he could do nothing to save her. What would he do? Marguerite at the thought instinctively pressed her hands to her heart. The agony of it all had become physically painful. She hoped that perhaps this pain meant approaching death. How easy would this simple solution be? The moon peered out from beneath the bank of clouds which had obscured her for so long. Smiling, she drew her penciled silver lines along the edge of towers and pinnacles, the frowning Beffroi and those stony walls which seemed to Marguerite as if they encircled a gigantic graveyard. The town crier had evidently ceased to read the proclamation. One by one the windows in the public square were lighted up from within. The citizens of Boulogne wanted to think over the strange events which had occurred without their knowledge, yet which were apparently to have such direful or such joyous consequences for them. A man to be captured. The mysterious English adventurer of whom they had all heard, but whom nobody had seen. And a woman, his wife, to be guarded until the man was safely under lock and key. Marguerite felt as if she could almost hear them talking it over and vowing that she should not escape, and that the Scarlet Pimpernel should soon be captured. A gentle wind stirred the old gnarled trees on the southern ramparts, a wind that sounded like the sigh of swiftly dying hope. What could Percy do now? His hands were tied, and he was inevitably destined to endure the awful agony of seeing the woman he loved die a terrible death beside him. Having captured him, they would not keep him long. No necessity for a trial, for detention, for formalities of any kind. A summary execution at dawn on the public place, a roll of drums, a public holiday to mark the joyful event, and a brave man will have ceased to live, a noble heart have stilled its beatings forever, whilst a whole nation gloried over the deed. Sleep, citizens of Boulogne. All is still. The night watchman had replaced the town crier. All was quiet within the city walls. The inhabitants could sleep in peace. A beneficent government was wakeful and guarding their rest. But many of the windows of the town remained lighted up, and at a little distance below her, round the corner so that she could not see it, a small crowd must have collected in front of the gateway which led into the courtyard of the gay old fort. Marguerite could hear a persistent murmur of voices, mostly angry and threatening, and once there were loud cries of, "English spies," and, "A la lantern." "The citizens of Boulogne are guarding the treasures of France," commented Chauvelin drily as he laughed again, that cruel, mirthless laugh of his. Then she roused herself from her torpor. She did not know how long she had stood beside the open window, but the fear seized her that that man must have seen and gloated over the agony of her mind. She straightened her graceful figure, threw back her proud head defiantly, and quietly walked up to the table, where Chauvelin seemed once more absorbed in the perusal of his papers. "Is this interview over?" she asked quietly, and without the slightest tremor in her voice. "May I go now?" "As soon as you wish," he replied with gentle irony. He regarded her with obvious delight, for truly she was beautiful, grand in this attitude of defiant despair. The man, who had spent the last half-hour in martyrizing her, gloried over the misery which he had wrought, and which all her strength of will could not entirely banish from her face. "Will you believe me, Lady Blakeney," he added, "that there is no personal animosity in my heart towards you or your husband? Have I not told you that I do not wish to compass his death? Yet you propose to send him to the guillotine as soon as you have laid hands on him. I have explained to you the measures which I have taken in order to make sure that we do lay hands on the Scarlet Pimpernel. Once he is in our power, it will rest with him to walk to the guillotine or to embark with you on board his yacht. You propose to place an alternative before Sir Percy Blakeney?" "Certainly. To offer him his life, and that of his charming wife. In exchange for what? His honor." "He will refuse, monsieur." "We shall see." Then he touched a handbell which stood on the table, and within a few seconds the door was opened and the soldier who had led Marguerite hither re-entered the room. The interview was at an end. It had served its purpose. Marguerite knew now that she must not even think of escape for herself, or hope for safety for the man she loved. Of Chauvelin's talk of a bargain which would touch Percy's honor she would not even think, and she was too proud to ask anything further from him. Chauvelin stood up and made her a deep bow, as she crossed the room and finally went out of the door. The little company of soldiers closed in around her and she was once more led along the dark passages, back to her own prison cell. Chapter 24, Colleagues. As soon as the door had closed behind Marguerite, there came from somewhere in the room the sound of a yawn, a grunt and a volley of oaths. The flickering light of the tallow candles had failed to penetrate into all the corners, and now from out one of these dark depths, a certain something began to detach itself, and to move forward towards the table at which Chauvelin had once more resumed his seat. "Has the damned aristocrat gone at last?" queried a hoarse voice, as a burly body clad in loose-fitting coat and mud-stained boots and breeches appeared within the narrow circle of light. "Yes," replied Chauvelin curtly. "And a cursed long time you have been with the baggage," grunted the other surlily. "Another 5 minutes and I'd have taken the matter in my own hands." "An assumption of authority," commented Chauvelin quietly, "to which your position here does not entitle you, citizen Carlot." Carlot de Herbois lounged lazily forward, and presently he threw his ill-knit figure into the chair lately vacated by Marguerite. His heavy, square face bore distinct traces of the fatigue endured in the past 24 hours on horseback or in jolting market wagons. His temper too appeared to have suffered on the way, and at Chauvelin's curt and dictatorial replies, he looked as surly as a chained dog. "You were wasting your breath over that woman," he muttered, bringing a large and grimy fist heavily down on the table, "and your measures are not quite so sound as you're fondly imagine, citizen Chauvelin." "They were mostly of your imagining, citizen Carlot," rejoined the other quietly, "and of your suggestion. I added a touch of strength and determination to your mild milk-and-water notions, citizen," snarled Carlot spitefully. "I'd have knocked that intriguing woman's brains out at the very first possible opportunity, had I been consulted earlier than this. Quite regardless of the fact that such violent measures would completely damn all our chances of success as far as the capture of the Scarlet Pimpernel is concerned," remarked Chauvelin drily, with a contemptuous shrug of the shoulders. "Once his wife is dead, the Englishman will never run his head into the noose which I have so carefully prepared for him. So you say, Chauvelin, and therefore I suggested to you certain measures to prevent the woman escaping which you will find adequate, I hope." "You need have no fear, citizen Carlot," said Chauvelin curtly. "This woman will make no attempt at escape now. If she does," and Carlot de Herbois swore an obscene oath, "I think she understands that we mean to put our threat in execution." "Threat? It was no empty threat, citizen. Sacre tonnerre. If that woman escapes now, by all the devils in hell I swear that I'll wield the guillotine myself and cut off the head of every able-bodied man or woman in Boulogne, with my own hands." As he said this his face assumed such an expression of inhuman cruelty, such a desire to kill, such a savage lust for blood, that instinctively Chauvelin shuddered and shrank away from his colleague. All through his career there is no doubt that this man, who was of gentle birth, of gentle breeding, and who had once been called le Marquis de Chauvelin, must have suffered in his susceptibilities and in his pride when in contact with the revolutionaries with whom he had chosen to cast his lot. He could not have thrown off all his old ideas of refinement quite so easily, as to feel happy in the presence of such men as Carlot de Herbois, or Marat in his day, men who had become brute beasts, more ferocious far than any wild animal, more scientifically cruel than any feline prowler in jungle or desert. One look in Carlot's distorted face was sufficient at this moment to convince Chauvelin that it were useless for him to view the proclamation against the citizens of Boulogne merely as an idle threat, even if he had wished to do so. That Marguerite would not, under the circumstances, attempt to escape, that Sir Percy Blakeney himself would be forced to give up all thoughts of rescuing her, was a foregone conclusion in Chauvelin's mind. But if this high-born English gentleman had not happened to be the selfless hero that he was, if Marguerite Blakeney were cast in a different, a rougher mold, if, in short, the Scarlet Pimpernel in the face of the proclamation did succeed in dragging his wife out of the clutches of the terrorists, then it was equally certain that Scarlet Pimpernel would carry out his rabid and cruel reprisals to the full. And if in the course of the wholesale butchery of the able-bodied and wage-earning inhabitants of Boulogne, the headsman should sink worn out, then would this ferocious sucker of blood put his own hand to the guillotine, with the same joy and lust which he had felt when he ordered 138 women of Nantes to be stripped naked by the soldiery before they were flung helter-skelter into the river. A touch of strength and determination. Citizen Scarlet Pimpernel had plenty of that. Was it he or Carrière who at Arras commanded mothers to stand by while their children were being guillotined? And surely it was Maynette, Scarlet's friend and colleague, who at Bedouin, because the red flag of the Republic had been mysteriously torn down overnight, burnt the entire little village down to the last hovel and guillotined every one of the 350 inhabitants. And Chauvelin knew all that. Nay more. He was himself a member of that so-called government which had countenanced these butcheries, by giving unlimited powers to men like Scarlet, like Maynette and Carrière. He was at one with them in their republican ideas, and he believed in the regeneration and the purification of France, through the medium of the guillotine, but he propounded his theories and carried out his most bloodthirsty schemes with physically clean hands and in an immaculately cut coat. Even now when Scarlet Pimpernel lounged before him, with mud-bespattered legs stretched out before him, with dubious linen at neck and wrists, and an odor of rank tobacco and stale, cheap wine pervading his whole personality, the more fastidious man of the world, who had consorted with the dandies of London and Brighton, winced at the enforced proximity. But it was the joint characteristic of all these men who had turned France into a vast butchery and charnel house, that they all feared and hated one another, even more wholeheartedly than they hated the aristocrats and so-called traitors whom they sent to the guillotine. Citizen Lebon is said to have dipped his sword into the blood which flowed from the guillotine, whilst exclaiming, "Come JLMC sang cul de traitor," but he and Scarlet and Danton and Robespierre, all of them in fact would have regarded with more delight still the blood of any one of their colleagues. At this very moment Scarlet Pimpernel and Chauvelin would with utmost satisfaction have denounced, one the other, to the tender mercies of the public prosecutor. Scarlet made no secret of his hatred for Chauvelin, and the latter disguised it but thinly under the veneer of contemptuous indifference. As for that damned Englishman, added Scarlet now after a slight pause and with another savage oath, if 'tis my good fortune to lay hands on him, I'd shoot him then and there like a mad dog, and rid France once and forever of this accursed spy. And think you, Citizen Scarlet, rejoined Chauvelin with a shrug of the shoulders, that France would be rid of all English adventurers by the summary death of this one man? He is the ringleader at any rate, and has at least 19 disciples to continue his traditions of conspiracy and intrigue. None perhaps so ingenious as himself, none with the same daring and good luck perhaps, but still a number of ardent fools only too ready to follow in the footsteps of their chief. Then there's the halo of martyrdom around the murdered hero, the enthusiasm created by his noble death. Nay, citizen, you have not lived among these English people, you do not understand them, or you would not talk of sending their popular hero to an honored grave. But Scarlet Pimpernel only shook his powerful frame like some big sulky dog, and spat upon the floor to express his contempt of this wild talk which seemed to have no real tangible purpose. "You have not caught your Scarlet Pimpernel yet, citizen?" he said with a snort. "No, but I will after sundown tomorrow." "How do you know?" "I have ordered the Angelus to be rung at one of the closed churches, and he agreed to fight a duel with me on the southern ramparts at that hour and on that day," said Chauvelin simply. "You take him for a fool?" sneered Scarlet. "No, only for a foolhardy adventurer. You imagine that with his wife as hostage in our hands, and the whole city of Boulogne on the lookout for him for the sake of the amnesty, that the man would be fool enough to walk on those ramparts at a given hour, for the express purpose of getting himself caught by you and your men? I am quite sure that if we do not lay hands on him before that given hour, that he will be on the ramparts at the Angelus tomorrow," said Chauvelin emphatically. Scarlet shrugged his broad shoulders. "Is the man mad?" he asked with an incredulous laugh. "Yes, I think so," rejoined the other with a smile. "And having caught your hare," queried Scarlet, "how do you propose to cook him?" 12 picked men will be on the ramparts ready to seize him the moment he appears. And to shoot him at sight, I hope. Only as a last resource, for the Englishman is powerful and may cause our half-famished men a good deal of trouble. But I want him alive if possible. What? A dead lion is safer than a live one any day. Oh, we'll kill him right enough, citizen. I pray you have no fear. I hold a weapon ready for that meddlesome Scarlet Pimpernel, which will be 1,000 times more deadly and more effectual than a chance shot, or even a guillotine. What weapon is that, citizen Chauvelin? Chauvelin leaned forward across the table and rested his chin in his hands. Instinctively Scarlet too leaned towards him, and both men peered furtively round them as if wondering if prying eyes happened to be lurking round. It was Chauvelin's pale eyes which now gleamed with hatred and with an insatiable lust for revenge at least as powerful as Scarlet's lust for blood. The unsteady light of the tallow candles threw grotesque shadows across his brows, and his mouth was set in such rigid lines of implacable cruelty that the brutish sot beside him gazed on him amazed, vaguely scenting here a depth of feeling which was beyond his power to comprehend. He repeated his question under his breath. What weapon do you mean to use against that accursed spy, citizen Chauvelin? Dishonor and ridicule, replied the other quietly. Bah! In exchange for his life and that of his wife. As the woman told you just now, he will refuse. We shall see, citizen. You are mad to think such things, citizen, and ill serve the Republic by sparing her bitterest foe. A long, sarcastic laugh broke from Chauvelin's parted lips. Spare him? Spare the Scarlet Pimpernel? He ejaculated. Nay, citizen, you need have no fear of that. But believe me, I have schemes in my head by which the man whom we all hate will be more truly destroyed than your guillotine could ever accomplish. Schemes, whereby the hero who is now worshipped in England as a demigod will suddenly become an object of loathing and of contempt. I see you understand me now. I wish to so cover him with ridicule that the very name of the small wayside flower will become a term of derision and of scorn. Only then shall we be rid of these pestilential English spies, only then will the entire League of the Scarlet Pimpernel become a thing of the past when its whilom leader, now thought akin to a god, will have found refuge in a suicide's grave, from the withering contempt of the entire world. Chauvelin had spoken low, hardly above a whisper, and the echo of his last words died away in the great squalid room like a long-drawn-out sigh. There was dead silence for a while save for the murmur in the wind outside and from the floor above the measured tread of the sentinel guarding the precious hostage in number 6. Both men were staring straight in front of them. Scarlet Pimpernel, incredulous, half contemptuous, did not altogether approve of these schemes which seemed to him wild and uncanny. He liked the direct simplicity of a summary trial, of the guillotine, or of his own well-stage-managed noyades. He did not feel that any ridicule or dishonor would necessarily paralyze a man in his efforts at intrigue, and would have liked to set Chauvelin's authority aside, to behead the woman upstairs and then to take his chances of capturing the man later on. But the orders of the Committee of Public Safety had been peremptory. He was to be Chauvelin's help, not his master, and to obey in all things. He did not dare to take any initiative in the matter, for in that case if he failed, the reprisals against him would indeed be terrible. He was fairly satisfied now that Chauvelin had accepted his suggestion of summarily sending to the guillotine one member of every family resident in Boulogne, if Marguerite succeeded in effecting an escape, and of a truth Chauvelin had hailed the fiendish suggestion with delight. The old abbé with his nephew and niece were undoubtedly not sufficient deterrents against the daring schemes of the Scarlet Pimpernel, who, as a matter of fact, could spirit them out of Boulogne just as easily as he would his own wife. Scarlet's plan tied Marguerite to her own prison cell more completely than any other measure could have done, more so indeed than the originator thereof knew or believed. A man like this de Herbois, born in the gutter, imbued with every brutish tradition, which generations of jailbirds had bequeathed to him, would not perhaps fully realize the fact that neither Sir Percy nor Marguerite Blakeney would ever save themselves at the expense of others. He had merely made the suggestion because he felt that Chauvelin's plans were complicated and obscure, and above all insufficient, and that perhaps after all the English adventurer and his wife would succeed in once more outwitting him, when there would remain the grand and bloody compensation of a wholesale butchery in Boulogne. But Chauvelin was quite satisfied. He knew that under present circumstances neither Sir Percy nor Marguerite would make any attempt to escape. The ex-ambassador had lived in England. He understood the class to which these two belonged, and was quite convinced that no attempt would be made on either side to get Lady Blakeney away whilst the present ferocious order against the breadwinner of every family in the town held good. The measures were sound enough. Chauvelin was easy in his mind about that. In another 24 hours he would hold the man completely in his power who had so boldly outwitted him last year. Tonight he would sleep in peace. An entire city was guarding the precious hostage. "We'll go to bed now, citizen," he said to Carlotte, who, tired and sulky, was moodily fingering the papers on the table. The scraping sound which he made thereby grated on Chauvelin's overstrung nerves. He wanted to be alone, and the sleepy brute's presence here jarred on his own solemn mood. To his satisfaction, Carlotte grunted a surly assent. Very leisurely he rose from his chair, stretched out his loose limbs, shook himself like a shaggy cur, and without uttering another word he gave his colleague a curt nod, and slowly lounged out of the room. Chapter 25. The Unexpected. Chauvelin heaved a deep sigh of satisfaction when Carlotte de Herbois finally left him to himself. He listened for a while until the heavy footsteps died away in the distance. Then leaning back in his chair, he gave himself over to the delights of the present situation. Marguerite in his power. Sir Percy Blakeney compelled to treat for her rescue if he did not wish to see her die a miserable death. My elusive hero," he muttered to himself, "methinks that we shall be able to cry quits at last." Outside everything had become still. Even the wind in the trees out there on the ramparts had ceased their melancholy moaning. The man was alone with his thoughts. He felt secure and at peace, sure of victory, content to await the events of the next 24 hours. The other side of the door, the guard which he had picked out from amongst the more feeble and ill-fed garrison of the little city for attendance on his own person, were ranged ready to respond to his call. Dishonor and ridicule. Derision and scorn, he murmured, gloating over the very sound of these words, which expressed all that he hoped to accomplish, utter abjections, then perhaps a suicide's grave. He loved the silence around him, for he could murmur these words and hear them echoing against the bare stone walls like the whisperings of all the spirits of hate which were waiting to lend him their aid. How long he had remained thus absorbed in his meditations, he could not afterwards have said. A minute or two perhaps at most, whilst he leaned back in his chair with eyes closed, savoring the sweets of his own thoughts, when suddenly the silence was interrupted by a loud and pleasant laugh and a drawly voice speaking in merry accents. "The Lud live you, Monsieur Chaubertin, and pray how do you propose to accomplish all these pleasant things?" In a moment Chauvelin was on his feet and with eyes dilated, lips parted in odd bewilderment, he was gazing towards the open window, where astride upon the sill, one leg inside the room, the other out, and with the moon shining full on his suit of delicate-colored cloth, his wide-caped coat and elegant chapeau bras, sat the imperturbable Sir Percy. "I heard you muttering such pleasant words, monsieur," continued Blakeney calmly, "that the temptation seized me to join in the conversation. A man talking to himself is ever in a sorry plight. He is either a madman or a fool." He laughed his own quaint and inane laugh and added apologetically, "Far be it from me, sir, to apply either epithet to you, demmed bad form calling another fellow names, just when he does not quite feel himself, eh? You don't feel quite yourself, I fancy just now, Monsieur Chaubertin? I beg pardon, Chauvelin." He sat there quite comfortably, one slender hand resting on the gracefully fashioned hilt of his sword, the sword of Lorenzo Cenci, the other holding up the gold-rimmed eyeglass through which he was regarding his avowed enemy. He was dressed as for a ball, and his perpetually amiable smile lurked round the corners of his firm lips. Chauvelin had undoubtedly for the moment lost his presence of mind. He did not even think of calling to his picked guard, so completely taken aback was he by this unforeseen move on the part of Sir Percy. Yet obviously he should have been ready for this eventuality. Had he not caused the town crier to loudly proclaim throughout the city that if one female prisoner escaped from Fort Gayole the entire able-bodied population of Boulogne would suffer? The moment Sir Percy entered the gates of the town, he could not help but hear the proclamation, and hear at the same time that this one female prisoner who was so precious a charge, was the wife of the English spy, the Scarlet Pimpernel. Moreover, was it not a fact that whenever or wherever the Scarlet Pimpernel was least expected there and then would he surely appear? Having once realized that it was his wife who was incarcerated in Fort Gayole, was it not natural that he would go and prowl around the prison, and along the avenue on the summit of the southern ramparts, which was accessible to every passer-by? No doubt he had lain in hiding among the trees, had perhaps caught snatches of Chauvelin's recent talk with Carlotte. It was all so natural, so simple. Strange that it should have been so unexpected. Furious at himself for his momentary stupor, he now made a vigorous effort to face his impudent enemy with the same sang-froid of which the latter had so inexhaustible a fund. He walked quietly towards the window, compelling his nerves to perfect calm and his mood to indifference. The situation had ceased to astonish him. Already his keen mind had seen its possibilities, its grimness and its humor, and he was quite prepared to enjoy these to the full. Sir Percy now was dusting the sleeve of his coat with a lace-edged handkerchief, But just as Chauvelin was about to come near him, he stretched out one leg, turning the point of a dainty boot towards the ex-ambassador. "Would you like to take hold of me by the leg, Monsieur Chaubertin?" he said gaily. "'Tis more effectual than a shoulder, and your picked guard of 6 stalwart fellows can have the other leg. I pray you, sir, do not look at me like that. I vow that it is myself and not my ghost. But if you still doubt me, I pray you call the guard, ere I fly out again towards that fitful moon." "Nay, Sir Percy," said Chauvelin with a steady voice, "I have no thought that you will take flight just yet. Methinks you desire conversation with me, or you had not paid me so unexpected a visit. Nay, sir, the air is too oppressive for lengthy conversation. I was strolling along these ramparts, thinking of our pleasant encounter at the hour of the Angelus tomorrow, when this light attracted me. Feared I had lost my way and climbed the window to obtain information." "As to your way to the nearest prison cell, Sir Percy?" queried Chauvelin drily. "As to anywhere where I could sit more comfortably than on this demmed sill. It must be very dusty, and I vow, 'tis terribly hard. I presume, Sir Percy, that you did my colleague and myself the honor of listening to our conversation? And you desire to talk secrets, Monsieur Chaubertin. You should have shut this window, and closed this avenue of trees against the chance passer-by. What we said was no secret, Sir Percy. It is all over the town tonight." "Quite so. You were only telling the devil your mind, eh?" "I had also been having conversation with Lady Blakeney." "Pray did you hear any of that, sir?" But Sir Percy had evidently not heard the question, for he seemed quite absorbed in the task of removing a speck of dust from his immaculate chapeau bras. "These hats are all the rage in England just now," he said airily, "but they have had their day, do you not think so, monsieur? When I return to town, I shall have to devote my whole mind to the invention of a new headgear." "When will you return to England, Sir Percy?" queried Chauvelin with good-natured sarcasm. "At the turn of the tide tomorrow eve, monsieur," replied Blakeney. "In company with Lady Blakeney?" "Certainly, sir, and yours if you will honor us with your company." "If you return to England tomorrow, Sir Percy, Lady Blakeney, I fear me, cannot accompany you." "You astonish me, sir," rejoined Blakeney with an exclamation of genuine and unaffected surprise. "I wonder now what would prevent her? All those whose death would be the result of her flight, if she succeeded in escaping from Boulogne." But Sir Percy was staring at him, with wide-open eyes expressive of utmost amazement. "Dear, dear, dear. What? But that sounds most unfortunate. You have not heard of the measures which I have taken to prevent Lady Blakeney quitting this city without our leave?" "No, Monsieur Chaubertin, no. I have heard nothing," rejoined Sir Percy blandly. "I lead a very retired life when I come abroad, and—" "Would you wish to hear them now?" "Quite unnecessary, sir, I assure you, and the hour is getting late. Sir Percy, are you aware of the fact that unless you listen to what I have to say, your wife will be dragged before the Committee of Public Safety in Paris within the next 24 hours? said Chauvelin firmly. "What swift horses you must have, sir," quoth Blakeney pleasantly. "Lot, to think of it. I always heard that these demmed French horses would never beat ours across country." But Chauvelin now would not allow himself to be ruffled by Sir Percy's apparent indifference. Keen reader of emotions as he was, he had not failed to note a distinct change in the drawly voice, a sound of something hard and trenchant in the flippant laugh, ever since Marguerite's name was first mentioned. Blakeney's attitude was apparently as careless, as audacious as before, but Chauvelin's keen eyes had not missed the almost imperceptible tightening of the jaw and the rapid clenching of one hand on the sword hilt even whilst the other toyed in graceful idleness with the filmy Mechlin lace cravat. Sir Percy's head was well thrown back, and the pale rays of the moon caught the edge of the clear-cut profile, the low massive brow, the drooping lids through which the audacious plotter was lazily regarding the man who held not only his own life, but that of the woman who was infinitely dear to him, in the hollow of his hand. "I am afraid, Sir Percy," continued Chauvelin drily, "that you are under the impression that bolts and bars will yield to your usual good luck, now that so precious a life is at stake as that of Lady Blakeney. I am a greater believer in impressions, Monsieur Chauvelin. I told her just now that if she quitted Boulogne ere the Scarlet Pimpernel is in our hands, we should summarily shoot one member of every family in the town, the breadwinner. A pleasant conceit, monsieur, and one that does infinite credit to your inventive faculties. Lady Blakeney therefore we hold safely enough," continued Chauvelin, who no longer heeded the mocking observations of his enemy. "As for the Scarlet Pimpernel, you have but to ring a bell, to raise a voice, and he too will be under lock and key within the next 2 minutes, eh? Passons, monsieur, you are dying to say something further? I pray you proceed, Your engaging countenance is becoming quite interesting in its seriousness. What I wish to say to you, Sir Percy, is in the nature of a proposed bargain. Indeed? Monsieur, you are full of surprises, like a pretty woman. And pray what are the terms of this proposed bargain? Your side of the bargain, Sir Percy, or mine? Which will you hear first? Oh, yours, monsieur, yours, I pray you. Have I not said that you are like a pretty woman? Placez-vous, dames, sir. Always. My share of the bargain, sir, is simple enough. Lady Blakeney, escorted by yourself and any of your friends who might be in this city at the time, shall leave Boulogne Harbor at sunset tomorrow, free and unmolested, if you on the other hand will do your share. I don't yet know what my share in this interesting bargain is to be, sir, but for the sake of argument let us suppose that I do not carry it out. What then? Then, Sir Percy, putting aside for the moment the question of the Scarlet Pimpernel altogether, then Lady Blakeney will be taken to Paris, and will be incarcerated in the prison of the Temple lately vacated by Marie Antoinette. There she will be treated in exactly the same way as the ex-queen is now being treated in the conciergerie. Do you know what that means, Sir Percy? It does not mean a summary trial and a speedy death with the halo and glory of martyrdom thrown in. It means days, weeks, nay months, perhaps, of misery and humiliation. It means that like Marie Antoinette she will never be allowed solitude for one single instant of the day or night. It means the constant proximity of soldiers drunk with cruelty and with hate, the insults, the shame. You hound! You dog! You cur! Do you not see that I must strangle you for this? The attack had been so sudden and so violent that Chauvelin had not the time to utter the slightest call for help. But a second ago, Sir Percy Blakeney had been sitting on the windowsill, outwardly listening with perfect calm to what his enemy had to say. Now he was at the latter's throat, pressing with long and slender hands the breath out of the Frenchman's body, his usually placid face distorted into a mask of hate. You cur! You cur! He repeated. Am I to kill you or will you unsay those words? Then suddenly he relaxed his grip. The habits of a lifetime would not be gainsaid even now. A second ago his face had been livid with rage and hate, now a quick flush overspread it, as if he were ashamed of this loss of self-control. He threw the little Frenchman away from him like he would a beast which had snarled, and passed his hand across his brow. Lud forgive me, he said quaintly, I had almost lost my temper. Chauvelin was not slow in recovering himself. He was plucky and alert, and his hatred for this man was so great that he had actually ceased to fear him. Now he quietly readjusted his cravat, made a vigorous effort to reconquer his breath, and said firmly as soon as he could contrive to speak at all. And if you did strangle me, Sir Percy, you would do yourself no good. The fate which I have mapped out for Lady Blakeney would then irrevocably be hers, for she is in our power and none of my colleagues are disposed to offer you a means of saving her from it, as I am ready to do. Blakeney was now standing in the middle of the room, with his hands buried in the pockets of his breeches, his manner and attitude once more calm, debonair, expressive of lofty self-possession and of absolute indifference. He came quite close to the meager little figure of his exultant enemy, thereby forcing the latter to look up at him. Oh. Yes, he said airily, I had nigh forgotten. You were talking of a bargain, my share of it? Is it me you want? Do you wish to see me in your Paris prisons? I assure you, sir, that the propinquity of drunken soldiers may disgust me, but it would in no way disturb the equanimity of my temper. I am quite sure of that, Sir Percy, and I can but repeat what I had the honor of saying to Lady Blakeney just now. I do not desire the death of so accomplished a gentleman as yourself. Strange, monsieur, retorted Blakeney, with a return of his accustomed flippancy. Now I do desire your death very strongly indeed, there would be so much less vermin on the face of the earth. But pardon me, I was interrupting you. Will you be so kind as to proceed? Chauvelin had not winced at the insult. His enemy's attitude now left him completely indifferent. He had seen that self-possessed man of the world, that dainty and fastidious dandy, in the throes of an overmastering passion. He had very nearly paid with his life for the joy of having roused that supercilious and dormant lion. In fact, he was ready to welcome any insults from Sir Percy Blakeney now, since these would be only additional evidences that the Englishman's temper was not yet under control. I will try to be brief, Sir Percy, he said, setting himself the task of imitating his antagonist's affected manner. Will you not sit down? We must try and discuss these matters like two men of the world. As for me, I am always happiest beside a board littered with papers. I am not an athlete, Sir Percy, and serve my country with my pen rather than with my fists. Whilst he spoke he had reached the table and once more took the chair whereon he had been sitting lately, when he dreamed the dreams which were so near realization now. He pointed with a graceful gesture to the other vacant chair, which Blakeney took without a word. "Ah," said Chauvelin with a sigh of satisfaction, "I see that we are about to understand one another. I have always felt it was a pity, Sir Percy, that you and I could not discuss certain matters pleasantly with one another. Now, about this unfortunate incident of Lady Blakeney's incarceration, I would like you to believe that I had no part in the arrangements which have been made for her detention in Paris. My colleagues have arranged it all, and I have vainly tried to protest against the rigorous measures which are to be enforced against her in the Temple prison. But these are answering so completely in the case of the ex-queen, they have so completely broken her spirit and her pride, that my colleagues felt that they would prove equally useful in order to bring the Scarlet Pimpernel, through his wife, to an humbler frame of mind." He paused a moment, distinctly pleased with his peroration, satisfied that his voice had been without a tremor and his face impassive, and wondering what effect this somewhat lengthy preamble had upon Sir Percy, who through it all had remained singularly quiet. Chauvelin was preparing himself for the next effect which he hoped to produce, and was vaguely seeking for the best words with which to fully express his meaning, when he was suddenly startled by a sound as unexpected as it was disconcerting. It was the sound of a loud and prolonged snore. He pushed the candle aside, which somewhat obstructed his line of vision, and casting a rapid glance at the enemy, with whose life he was toying even as a cat doth with that of a mouse, he saw that the aforesaid mouse was calmly and unmistakably asleep. An impatient oath escaped Chauvelin's lips, and he brought his fist heavily down on the table, making the metal candlesticks rattle and causing Sir Percy to open one sleepy eye. "A thousand pardons, sir," said Blakeney with a slight yawn. "I am so demmed fatigued, and your preface was unduly long. Beastly bad form, I know, going to sleep during a sermon, but I haven't had a wink of sleep all day. I pray you to excuse me." "Will you condescend to listen, Sir Percy?" queried Chauvelin peremptorily, "or shall I call the guard and give up all thoughts of treating with you?" "Just whichever you demmed well prefer, sir," rejoined Blakeney impatiently, and once more stretching out his long limbs, he buried his hands in the pockets of his breeches and apparently prepared himself for another quiet sleep. Chauvelin looked at him for a moment, vaguely wondering what to do next. He felt strangely irritated at what he firmly believed was mere affectation on Blakeney's part, and although he was burning with impatience to place the terms of the proposed bargain before this man, yet he would have preferred to be interrogated, to deliver his either-or with becoming sternness and decision, rather than to take the initiative in this discussion, where he should have been calm and indifferent, whilst his enemy should have been nervous and disturbed. Sir Percy's attitude had disconcerted him, a touch of the grotesque had been given to what should have been a tense moment, and it was terribly galling to the pride of the ex-diplomatist that with this elusive enemy and in spite of his own preparedness for any eventuality, it was invariably the unforeseen that happened. After a moment's reflection, however, he decided upon a fresh course of action. He rose and crossed the room, keeping as much as possible an eye upon Sir Percy, but the latter sat placid and dormant and evidently in no hurry to move. Chauvelin, having reached the door, opened it noiselessly, and to the sergeant in command of his bodyguard who stood at attention outside, he whispered hurriedly, "The prisoner from number 6. Let 2 of the men bring her hither back to me at once." Chapter 26. The Terms of the Bargain. Less than 3 minutes later, there came to Chauvelin's expectant ears the soft sound made by a woman's skirts against the stone floor. During those 3 minutes, which had seemed an eternity to his impatience, he had sat silently watching the slumber, affected or real, of his enemy. Directly he heard the word, "Halt!" outside the door, he jumped to his feet. The next moment Marguerite had entered the room. Hardly had her foot crossed the threshold than Sir Percy rose, quietly and without haste but evidently fully awake, and turning towards her, made her a low obeisance. She, poor woman, had of course caught sight of him at once. His presence here, Chauvelin's demand for her reappearance, the soldiers in a small compact group outside the door, all these were unmistakable proofs that the awful cataclysm had at last occurred. The Scarlet Pimpernel, Percy Blakeney, her husband, was in the hands of the terrorists of France, and though face to face with her now, with an open window close to him, and an apparently helpless enemy under his hand, he could not, owing to the fiendish measures taken by Chauvelin, raise a finger to save himself and her. Mercifully for her, nature, in the face of this appalling tragedy, deprived her of the full measure of her senses. She could move and speak and see, she could hear and in a measure understand what was said, but she was really an automaton or a sleepwalker, moving and speaking mechanically and without due comprehension. Possibly, if she had then and there fully realized all that the future meant, she would have gone mad with the horror of it all. "Lady Blakeney," began Chauvelin after he had quickly dismissed the soldiers from the room, "when you and I parted from one another just now, I had no idea that I should so soon have the pleasure of a personal conversation with Sir Percy. There is no occasion yet, believe me, for sorrow or fear. Another 24 hours at most, and you will be on board the Daydream, outward bound for England. Sir Percy himself might perhaps accompany you. He does not desire that you should journey to Paris, and I may safely say that in his mind, he has already accepted certain little conditions which I have been forced to impose upon him ere I sign the order for your absolute release." "Conditions?" she repeated vaguely and stupidly, looking in bewilderment from one to the other. "You are tired, dear," said Sir Percy quietly. "Will you not sit down?" He held the chair gallantly for her. She tried to read his face, but could not catch even a flash from beneath the heavy lids which obstinately veiled his eyes. "Oh, it is a mere matter of exchanging signatures," continued Chauvelin in response to her inquiring glance and toying with the papers which were scattered on the table. "Here you see is the order to allow Sir Percy Blakeney and his wife, née Marguerite St. just to quit the town of Boulogne unmolested." He held a paper out towards Marguerite, inviting her to look at it. She caught sight of an official-looking document, bearing the motto and seal of the Republic of France, and of her own name and Percy's written thereon in full. "It is perfectly en règle, I assure you," continued Chauvelin, "and only awaits my signature." He now took up another paper which looked like a long, closely written letter. Marguerite watched his every movement, for instinct told her that the supreme moment had come. There was a look of almost superhuman cruelty and malice in the little Frenchman's eyes as he fixed them on the impassive figure of Sir Percy, the while with slightly trembling hands he fingered that piece of paper and smoothed out its creases with loving care. "I am quite prepared to sign the order for your release, Lady Blakeney," he said, keeping his gaze still keenly fixed upon Sir Percy. "When it is signed you will understand that our measures against the citizens of Boulogne will no longer hold good, and that on the contrary, the general amnesty and free pardon will come into force." "Yes, I understand that," she replied. "And all that will come to pass, Lady Blakeney, the moment Sir Percy will write me in his own hand a letter, in accordance with the draft which I have prepared, and sign it with his name." "Shall I read it to you?" he asked. "If you please. You will see how simple it all is. A mere matter of form. I pray you do not look upon it with terror, but only as the prelude to that general amnesty and free pardon, which I feel sure will satisfy the philanthropic heart of the noble Scarlet Pimpernel, since 60 at least of the inhabitants of Boulogne will owe their life and freedom to him." "I am listening, monsieur," she said calmly. "As I have already had the honor of explaining, this little document is in the form of a letter addressed personally to me and of course in French," he said finally, and then he looked down on the paper and began to read. "Citizen Chauvelin, in consideration of a further sum of 1,000,000 francs and on the understanding that this ridiculous charge brought against me of conspiring against the Republic of France is immediately withdrawn, and I am allowed to return to England unmolested, I am quite prepared to acquaint you with the names and whereabouts of certain persons who under the guise of the League of the Scarlet Pimpernel are even now conspiring to free the woman Marie Antoinette and her son from prison and to place the latter upon the throne of France. You are quite well aware that under the pretense of being the leader of a gang of English adventurers, who never did the Republic of France and her people any real harm, I have actually been the means of unmasking many a royalist plot before you, and of bringing many persistent conspirators to the guillotine. I am surprised that you should cavil at the price I am asking this time for the very important information with which I am able to furnish you, whilst you have often paid me similar sums for work which was a great deal less difficult to do. In order to serve your government effectually, both in England and in France, I must have a sufficiency of money to enable me to live in a costly style befitting a gentleman of my rank. Were I to alter my mode of life I could not continue to mix in that same social milieu to which all my friends belong and wherein, as you are well aware, most of the royalist plots are hatched. Trusting therefore to receive a favorable reply to my just demands within the next 24 hours, whereupon the names in question shall be furnished you forthwith, I have the honor to remain, citizen, your humble and obedient servant." When he had finished reading, Chauvelin quietly folded the paper up again, and then only did he look at the man and the woman before him. Marguerite sat very erect, her head thrown back, her face very pale and her hands tightly clutched in her lap. She had not stirred whilst Chauvelin read out the infamous document, with which he desired to brand a brave man with the ineradicable stigma of dishonor and of shame. After she heard the first words, she looked up swiftly and questioningly at her husband, but he stood at some little distance from her, right out of the flickering circle of yellowish light made by the burning tallow candle. He was as rigid as a statue, standing in his usual attitude with legs apart and hands buried in his breeches pockets. She could not see his face. Whatever she may have felt with regard to the letter, as the meaning of it gradually penetrated into her brain, she was, of course, convinced of one thing, and that was that never for a moment would Percy dream of purchasing his life or even hers at such a price. But she would have liked some sign from him, some look by which she could be guided as to her immediate conduct. As, however, he gave neither look nor sign, she preferred to assume an attitude of silent contempt. But even before Chauvelin had had time to look from one face to the other, a prolonged and merry laugh echoed across the squalid room. Sir Percy, with head thrown back, was laughing wholeheartedly. "A magnificent epistle, sir," he said gaily. "Lud love you, where did you wield the pen so gracefully? I vow that if I sign this interesting document no one will believe I could have expressed myself with perfect ease. And in French too." "Nay, Sir Percy," rejoined Chauvelin drily, "I have thought of all that, and lest in the future there should be any doubt as to whether your own hand had or had not penned the whole of this letter, I also make it a condition that you write out every word of it yourself, and sign it here in this very room, in the presence of Lady Blakeney, of myself, of my colleagues, and of at least half a dozen other persons whom I will select." "It is indeed admirably thought out, monsieur," rejoined Sir Percy. "And what is to become of the charming epistle, may I ask, after I have written and signed it? Pardon my curiosity. I take a natural interest in the matter, and truly your ingenuity passes belief. Oh, the fate of this letter will be as simple as was the writing thereof. A copy of it will be published in our Gazette de Paris as a bait for enterprising English journalists. They will not be backward in getting hold of so much interesting matter. Can you not see the attractive headlines in the London Gazette, Sir Percy? The League of the Scarlet Pimpernel unmasked. A gigantic hoax. The origin of the Blakeney millions. I believe that journalism in England has reached a high standard of excellence, and even the Gazette de Paris is greatly read in certain towns of your charming country. His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales and various other influential gentlemen in London will, on the other hand, be granted a private view of the original through the kind offices of certain devoted friends whom we possess in England. I don't think that you need have any fear, Sir Percy, that your calligraphy will sink into oblivion. It will be our business to see that it obtains the full measure of publicity which it deserves." He paused a moment, then his manner suddenly changed. The sarcastic tone died out of his voice, and there came back into his face that look of hatred and cruelty which Blakeney's persiflage had always the power to evoke. "You may rest assured of one thing, Sir Percy," he said with a harsh laugh, "that enough mud will be thrown at that erstwhile glorious Scarlet Pimpernel. Some of it will be bound to stick." "Nay, Monsieur Chaubertin," quoth Blakeney lightly, "I have no doubt that you and your colleagues are past masters in the graceful art of mud-throwing. But pardon me, I was interrupting you. Continue, monsieur, continue, I pray. 'Pon my honor, the matter is vastly diverting. Nay, sir, after the publication of this diverting epistle, meseems your honor will cease to be a marketable commodity." "Undoubtedly, sir," rejoined Sir Percy, apparently quite unruffled. "Pardon a slip of the tongue, we are so much the creatures of habit. As you were saying?" "I have but little more to say, sir. But lest there should even now be lurking in your mind a vague hope that, having written this letter, you could easily in the future deny its authorship, let me tell you this. My measures are well taken, there will be witnesses to your writing of it. You will sit here in this room, unfettered, uncoerced in any way, and the money spoken of in the letter will be handed over to you by my colleague, after a few suitable words spoken by him, and you will take the money from him, Sir Percy, and the witnesses will see you take it after having seen you write the letter. They will understand that you are being paid by the French government for giving information anent royalist plots in this country and in England. They will understand that your identity as the leader of that so-called band is not only known to me and to my colleague, but that it also covers your real character and profession as the paid spy of France. Marvelous, I call it, demmed marvelous," quoth Sir Percy blandly. Chauvelin had paused, half-choked by his own emotion, his hatred and prospective revenge. He passed his handkerchief over his forehead, which was streaming with perspiration. "Warm work, this sort of thing, Monsieur Chaubertin?" queried his imperturbable enemy. Marguerite said nothing. The whole thing was too horrible for words, but she kept her large eyes fixed upon her husband's face, waiting for that look, that sign from him which would have eased the agonizing anxiety in her heart, and which never came. With a great effort now, Chauvelin pulled himself together and, though his voice still trembled, he managed to speak with a certain amount of calm. "Probably, Sir Percy, you know," he said, "that throughout the whole of France we are inaugurating a series of national fêtes, in honor of the new religion which the people are about to adopt. Demoiselle Désirée Candle, whom you know, will at these festivals impersonate the goddess of reason, the only deity whom we admit now in France. She has been specially chosen for this honor, owing to the services which she has rendered us recently, and as Boulogne happens to be the lucky city in which we have succeeded in bringing the Scarlet Pimpernel to justice, the national fête will begin within these city walls, with Demoiselle Candle as the thrice-honored goddess. And you will be very merry here in Boulogne, I dare swear." "Aye, merry, sir," said Chauvelin with an involuntary and savage snarl, as he placed a long claw-like finger upon the momentous paper before him. "Merry, for we here in Boulogne will see that which will fill the heart of every patriot in France with gladness. 'Twas not the death of the Scarlet Pimpernel we wanted, not the noble martyrdom of England's chosen hero, but his humiliation and defeat, derision and scorn, contumely and contempt. You asked me airily just now, Sir Percy, how I propose to accomplish this object. Well, you know it now, by forcing you, to write and sign a letter and to take money from my hands which will brand you forever as a liar and informer, and cover you with the thick and slimy mud of irreclaimable infamy." "Lot, sir," said Sir Percy pleasantly, "what a wonderful command you have of our language. I wish I could speak French half as well." Marguerite had risen like an automaton from her chair. She felt that she could no longer sit still. She wanted to scream out at the top of her voice, all the horror she felt for this dastardly plot, which surely must have had its origin in the brain of devils. She could not understand Percy. This was one of those awful moments, which she had been destined to experience once or twice before, when the whole personality of her husband seemed to become shadowy before her, to slip, as it were, past her comprehension, leaving her indescribably lonely and wretched, trusting yet terrified. She thought that long ere this he would have flung back every insult in his opponent's teeth. She did not know what inducements Chauvelin had held out in exchange for the infamous letter, what threats he had used. That her own life and freedom were at stake was of course evident, but she cared nothing for life, and he should know that certainly she would care still less if such a price had to be paid for it. She longed to tell him all that was in her heart, longed to tell him how little she valued her life, how highly she prized his honor. But how could she, before this fiend who snarled and sneered in his anticipated triumph, and surely Percy knew. And knowing all that, why did he not speak? Why did he not tear that infamous paper from out that devil's hands and fling it in his face? Yet, though her loving ear caught every intonation of her husband's voice, she could not detect the slightest harshness in his airy laugh. His tone was perfectly natural and he seemed to be, indeed, just as he appeared, vastly amused. Then she thought that perhaps he would wish her to go now, that he felt desire to be alone with this man, who had outraged him in everything that he held most holy and most dear, his honor and his wife. That perhaps, knowing that his own temper was no longer under control, he did not wish her to witness the rough and ready chastisement which he was intending to mete out to this dastardly intriguer. Yes, that was it, no doubt. Herein she could not be mistaken. She knew his fastidious notions of what was due and proper in the presence of a woman, and that even at a moment like this, he would wish the manners of London drawing-rooms to govern his every action. Therefore she rose to go, and as she did so, once more tried to read the expression in his face, to guess what was passing in his mind. "Nay, madam," he said, whilst he bowed gracefully before her, "I fear me this lengthy conversation hath somewhat fatigued you. This merry jest, twixt my engaging friend and myself should not have been prolonged so far into the night. Monsieur, I pray you, will you not give orders that her ladyship be escorted back to her room?" He was still standing outside the circle of light, and Marguerite instinctively went up to him. For this 1 second she was oblivious of Chauvelin's presence. She forgot her well-schooled pride, her firm determination to be silent and to be brave. She could no longer restrain the wild beatings of her heart, the agony of her soul, and with sudden impulse she murmured in a voice broken with intense love and subdued, passionate appeal, "Percy." He drew back a step further into the gloom. This made her realize the mistake she had made in allowing her husband's most bitter enemy to get this brief glimpse into her soul. Chauvelin's thin lips curled with satisfaction. The brief glimpse had been sufficient for him. The rapidly whispered name, the broken accent had told him what he had not known hitherto. Namely, that between this man and woman there was a bond far more powerful than that which usually existed between husband and wife, and merely made up of chivalry on the one side and trustful reliance on the other. Marguerite, having realized her mistake, ashamed of having betrayed her feelings even for a moment, threw back her proud head and gave her exultant foe a look of defiance and of scorn. He responded with one of pity, not altogether unmixed with deference. There was something almost unearthly and sublime in this beautiful woman's agonizing despair. He lowered his head and made her a deep obeisance, lest she should see the satisfaction and triumph which shone through his pity. As usual, Sir Percy remained quite imperturbable, and now it was he who, with characteristic impudence, touched the handbell on the table. "Excuse this intrusion, monsieur," he said lightly. "Her ladyship is overfatigued and would be best in her room." Marguerite threw him a grateful look. After all, she was only a woman and was afraid of breaking down. In her mind there was no issue to the present deadlock save in death. For this she was prepared and had but one great hope, that she could lie in her husband's arms just once again before she died. Now, since she could not speak to him, scarcely dared to look into the loved face, she was quite ready to go. In answer to the bell, the soldier had entered. "If Lady Blakeney desires to go," said Chauvelin. She nodded and Chauvelin gave the necessary orders. Two soldiers stood at attention ready to escort Marguerite back to her prison cell. As she went towards the door she came to within a couple of steps from where her husband was standing, bowing to her as she passed. She stretched out an icy cold hand towards him, and he, in the most approved London fashion, with the courtly grace of a perfect English gentleman, took the little hand in his and stooping very low kissed the delicate fingertips. Then only did she notice that the strong, nervy hand which held hers trembled perceptibly, and that his lips, which for an instant rested on her fingers, were burning hot. Chapter 27. The Decision. Once more the two men were alone. As far as Chauvelin was concerned, he felt that everything was not yet settled, and until a moment ago he had been in doubt as to whether Sir Percy would accept the infamous conditions which had been put before him, or allow his pride and temper to get the better of him and throw the deadly insults back into his adversary's teeth. But now a new secret had been revealed to the astute diplomatist. A name, softly murmured by a broken-hearted woman, had told him a tale of love and passion, which he had not even suspected before. Since he had made this discovery he knew that the ultimate issue was no longer in doubt. Sir Percy Blakeney, the bold adventurer, ever ready for a gamble where lives were at stake, might have demurred before he subscribed to his own dishonor, in order to save his wife from humiliation and the shame of the terrible fate that had been mapped out for her. But the same man passionately in love with such a woman as Marguerite Blakeney would count the world well lost for her sake. One sudden fear alone had shot through Chauvelin's heart when he stood face to face with the two people whom he had so deeply and cruelly wronged, and that was that Blakeney, throwing aside all thought of the scores of innocent lives that were at stake, might forget everything, risk everything, dare everything, in order to get his wife away there and then. For the space of a few seconds Chauvelin had felt that his own life was in jeopardy, and that the Scarlet Pimpernel would indeed make a desperate effort to save himself and his wife. But the fear was short-lived. Marguerite, as he had well foreseen, would never save herself at the expense of others, and she was tied. Tut, tut. That was his triumph and his joy. When Marguerite finally left the room, Sir Percy made no motion to follow her, but turned once more quietly to his antagonist. "As you were saying, monsieur?" he queried lightly. "Oh, there is nothing more to say, Sir Percy," rejoined Chauvelin. "My conditions are clear to you, are they not? Lady Blakeney's and your own immediate release in exchange for a letter written to me by your own hand, and signed here by you, in this room, in my presence and that of sundry other persons whom I need not name just now. Also certain money passing from my hand to yours. Failing the letter, a long, hideously humiliating sojourn in the Temple prison for your wife, a prolonged trial and the guillotine as a happy release. I would add the same thing for yourself, only that I will do you the justice to admit that you probably do not care." "Nay, a grave mistake, monsieur. I do care, vastly care, I assure you, and would seriously object to ending my life on your demmed guillotine, a nasty, uncomfortable thing I should say, and I am told that an inexperienced barber is deputed to cut one's hair. Brr. Now, on the other hand, I like the idea of a national fete, that pretty wench Candle dressed as a goddess, the boom of the cannon when your amnesty comes into force. You will boom the cannon, will you not, monsieur? Cannon are demmed noisy, but they are effective sometimes, do you not think so, monsieur?" "Very effective certainly, Sir Percy," sneered Chauvelin, "and we will certainly boom the cannon from this very fort, and it so please you. At what hour, monsieur, is my letter to be ready?" "Why, at any hour you please, Sir Percy. The Daydream could weigh anchor at 8 o'clock. Would an hour before that be convenient to yourself?" "Certainly, Sir Percy, If you will honor me by accepting my hospitality in these uncomfortable quarters until 7 o'clock tomorrow eve? I thank you, monsieur. Then am I to understand, Sir Percy, that—" A loud and ringing laugh broke from Blakeney's lips. "That I accept your bargain, man? Zounds, I tell you I accept. I'll write the letter, I'll sign it, and you have our free passes ready for us in exchange. At 7 o'clock tomorrow eve, did you say? Man, do not look so astonished. The letter, the signature, the money, all your witnesses, have everything ready. I accept, I say. And now, in the name of all the evil spirits in hell, let me have some supper and a bed, for I vow that I am demmed fatigued." And without more ado Sir Percy once more rang the handbell, laughing boisterously the while. Then suddenly, with quick transition of mood, his laugh was lost in a gigantic yawn, and throwing his long body onto a chair, he stretched out his legs, buried his hands in his pockets, and the next moment was peacefully asleep. Chapter 28. The Midnight Watch. Boulogne had gone through many phases, in its own languid and sleepy way, whilst the great upheaval of a gigantic revolution shook other cities of France to their very foundations. At first the little town had held somnolently aloof, and whilst Lyons and Tours conspired and rebelled, whilst Marseilles and Toulon opened their ports to the English and Dunkirk was ready to surrender to the Allied forces, she had gazed through half-closed eyes at all the turmoil, and then quietly turned over and gone to sleep again. Boulogne fished and mended nets, built boats and manufactured boots with placid content, whilst France murdered her king and butchered her citizens. The initial noise of the Great Revolution was only wafted on the southerly breezes from Paris to the little seaport towns of northern France, and lost much of its volume and power in this aerial transit. The fisher folk were too poor to worry about the dethronement of kings. The struggle for daily existence, the perils and hardships of deep-sea fishing engrossed all the faculties they possessed. As for the burghers and merchants of the town, they were at first content with reading an occasional article in the Gazette de Paris, or the Gazette de Tribunox, brought hither by one or other of the many travelers who crossed the city on their way to the harbor. They were interested in these articles, at times even comfortably horrified at the doings in Paris, the executions and the tumbrils, but on the whole they liked the idea that the country was in future to be governed by duly chosen representatives of the people, rather than be a prey to the despotism of kings, and they were really quite pleased to see the tricolour flag hoisted on the old Beffroi, there where the snow-white standard of the Bourbons had erstwhile flaunted its golden fleur-de-lis. In the glare of the midday sun, the worthy burgesses of Boulogne were ready to shout, "Vive la République," with the same cheerful and raucous Normandy accent as they had lately shouted, "Dieu protège le roi." The first awakening from this happy torpor came when that tent was put up on the landing stage in the harbor. Officials, dressed in shabby uniforms and wearing tricolour cockades and scarves, were now quartered in the town hall, and repaired daily to that roughly erected tent, accompanied by so many soldiers from the garrison. There installed, they busied themselves with examining carefully the passports of all those who desired to leave or enter Boulogne. Fisherfolk who had dwelt in the city, father and son and grandfather and many generations before that, and had come and gone in and out of their own boats as they pleased, were now stopped as they beached their craft and made to give an account of themselves to these officials from Paris. It was, of a truth, more than ridiculous, that these strangers should ask of Jean-Marie who he was, or of Pierre what was his business, or of Désir François whither he was going, when Jean-Marie and Pierre and Désir François had plied their nets in the roads outside Boulogne harbor for more years than they would care to count. It also caused no small measure of annoyance that fishermen were ordered to wear tricolour cockades on their caps. They had no special ill feeling against tricolour cockades, but they did not care about them. Jean-Marie flatly refused to have one pinned on, and being admonished somewhat severely by one of the Paris officials, he became obstinate about the whole thing and threw the cockade violently on the ground and spat upon it, not from any sentiment of anti-republicanism, but just from a feeling of Norman doggedness. He was arrested, shut up in Fort Gayole, tried as a traitor and publicly guillotined. The consternation in Boulogne was appalling. The one little spark had found its way to a barrel of blasting powder and caused a terrible explosion. Within 24 hours of Jean-Marie's execution the whole town was in the throes of the revolution. What the death of King Louis, the arrest of Marie Antoinette, the massacres of September had failed to do, that the arrest and execution of an elderly fisherman accomplished in a trice. People began to take sides in politics. Some families realized that they came from ancient lineage, and that their ancestors had helped to build up the throne of the Bourbons. Others looked up ancient archives and remembered past oppressions at the hands of the aristocrats. Thus some burghers of Boulogne became ardent reactionaries, whilst others secretly nursed enthusiastic royalist convictions. Some were ready to throw in their lot with the anarchists, to deny the religion of their fathers, to scorn the priests and close the places of worship. Others adhered strictly still to the usages and practices of the church. Arrest became frequent. The guillotine erected in the Place de la Sénéchaussée had plenty of work to do. Soon the cathedral was closed, the priests thrown into prison, while scores of families hoped to escape a similar fate by summary flight. Vague rumors of a band of English adventurers soon reached the little seaport town. The Scarlet Pimpernel, English spy or hero as he was alternately called, had helped many a family with pronounced royalist tendencies to escape the fury of the bloodthirsty terrorists. Thus gradually the anti-revolutionaries had been weeded out of the city, some by death and imprisonment, others by flight. Boulogne became the hotbed of anarchism. The idlers and loafers, inseparable from any town where there is a garrison and a harbor, practically ruled the city now. Denunciations were the order of the day. Everyone who owned any money or lived with any comfort was accused of being a traitor and suspected of conspiracy. The fisher folk wandered about the city, surly and discontented. Their trade was at a standstill, but there was a trifle to be earned by giving information which meant the arrest, ofttimes the death of men, women and even children who had tried to seek safety in flight, and to denounce whom, as they were trying to hire a boat anywhere along the coast, meant a good square meal for a starving family. Then came the awful cataclysm. A woman, a stranger, had been arrested and imprisoned in the Fort Gaol, and the town crier publicly proclaimed that if she escaped from jail, one member of every family in the town, rich or poor, Republican or Royalist, Catholic or Freethinker, would be summarily guillotined. That member the breadwinner. Why then with the Duvals it would be young François Auguste. He keeps his old mother with his boot-making. And it would be Marie Lebon, she has her blind father dependent on her net-mending. And old Mother Laferrière, whose grandchildren were left penniless, she keeps them from starvation by her washtub. But François Auguste is a real Republican. He belongs to the Jacobin Club. And look at Pierre, who never meets a Calatin but he must needs spit on him. Is there no safety anywhere? Are we to be butchered like so many cattle? Somebody makes the suggestion. It is a threat, they would not dare. Would not dare? 'Tis old André Lemoyne who has spoken, and he spits vigorously on the ground. André Lemoyne has been a soldier. He was in La Vendée. He was wounded at Tours, and he knows. Would not dare? He says in a whisper. I tell you, friends, that there's nothing the present government would not dare. There was the Plain Saint Mauve. Did you ever hear about that? Little children fusilade by the score. Little ones, I say, and women with babies at their breasts. Weren't they innocent? 500 innocent people butchered in La Vendée, until the headsman sank, warn not. I could tell worse than that, for I know. There's nothing they would not dare. Consternation was so great that the matter could not even be discussed. We'll go to Gaol and see this woman at any rate. Angry, sullen crowds assembled in the streets. The proclamation had been read just as the men were leaving the public houses, preparing to go home for the night. They brought the news to the women who, at home, were setting the soup and bread on the table for their husband's supper. There was no thought of going to bed or of sleeping that night. The breadwinner in every family and all those dependent on him for daily sustenance were trembling for their lives. Resistance to the barbarous order would have been worse than useless, nor did the thought of it enter the heads of these humble and ignorant fisher folk, wearied out with the miserable struggle for existence. There was not sufficient spirit left in this half-starved population of a small provincial city to suggest open rebellion. A regiment of soldiers come up from the south were quartered in the chateau, and the natives of Boulogne could not have mustered more than a score of disused blunderbusses between them. Then they remembered tales which André Lemoyne had told, the fate of Lyons razed to the ground, of Toulon burnt to ashes, and they did not dare rebel. But brothers, fathers, sons trooped out towards Gaol, in order to have a good look at the frowning pile, which held the hostage for their safety. It looked dark and gloomy enough, save for one window which gave on the southern ramparts. This window was wide open and a feeble light flickered from the room beyond, and as the men stood about, gazing at the walls in sulky silence, they suddenly caught the sound of a loud laugh proceeding from within, and of a pleasant voice speaking quite gaily in a language which they did not understand, but which sounded like English. Against the heavy oaken gateway, leading to the courtyard of the prison, the proclamation written on stout parchment had been pinned up. Beside it hung a tiny lantern, the dim light of which flickered in the evening breeze, and brought at times into sudden relief the bold writing and heavy signature, which stood out, stern and grim, against the yellowish background of the paper, like black signs of approaching death. Facing the gateway and the proclamation, the crowd of men took its stand. The moon, from behind them, cast fitful, silvery glances at the weary heads bent in anxiety and watchful expectancy. On old heads and young heads, dark, curly heads and heads grizzled with age, on backs bent with toil, and hands rough and gnarled like seasoned timber. All night the men stood and watched. Sentinels from the town guard were stationed at the gates, but these might prove inattentive or insufficient. They had not the same price at stake, so the entire able-bodied population of Boulogne watched the gloomy prison that night, lest anyone escaped by wall or window. They were guarding the precious hostage whose safety was the stipulation for their own. There was dead silence among them and dead silence all around, save for that monotonous talk of the parchment flapping in the breeze. The moon, who all along had been capricious and chary of her light, made a final retreat behind a gathering bank of clouds, and the crowd, the soldiers and the great grim walls were all equally wrapped in gloom. Only the little lantern on the gateway now made a ruddy patch of light, and tinged that fluttering parchment with the color of blood. Every now and then an isolated figure would detach itself from out the watching throng, and go up to the heavy, oaken door, in order to gaze at the proclamation. Then the light of the lantern illumined a dark head or a gray one. For a moment or two, black or white locks were stirred gently in the wind, and a sigh of puzzlement and disappointment would be distinctly heard. At times a group of 3 or 4 would stand there for a while, not speaking, only sighing and casting eager questioning glances at one another, whilst trying vainly to find some hopeful word, some turn of phrase of meaning that would be less direful, in that grim and ferocious proclamation. Then a rough word from the sentinel, a push from the butt end of a bayonet would disperse the little group and send the men, sullen and silent, back into the crowd. Thus they watched for hours whilst the bell of the Beffroi told all the hours of that tedious night. A thin rain began to fall in the small hours of the morning, a wetting, soaking drizzle which chilled the weary watchers to the bone. But they did not care. We must not sleep, for the woman might escape. Some of them squatted down in the muddy road, the luckier ones managed to lean their backs against the slimy walls. Twice before the hour of midnight they heard that same quaint and merry laugh proceeding from the lighted room, through the open window. Once it sounded very low and very prolonged as if in response to a delightful joke. Anon the heavy gateway of Gaol was opened from within, and 6 soldiers came walking out of the courtyard. They were dressed in the uniform of the town guard, but had evidently been picked out of the rank and file, for all 6 were exceptionally tall and stalwart, and towered above the sentinel, who saluted and presented arms as they marched out of the gate. In the midst of them walked a slight, dark figure, clad entirely in black, save for the tricolor scarf round his waist. The crowd of watchers gazed on the little party with suddenly awakened interest. "Who is it?" whispered some of the men. "The citizen governor," suggested one. "The new public executioner," ventured another. No, quoth Pierre Maxime, the doyen of Boulogne fishermen, and a great authority on every matter public or private with the town. No, he is the man who has come down from Paris, the friend of Robespierre. He makes the laws now, the citizen governor even must obey him. 'Tis he who made the law that if the woman up yonder should escape— Hush, itch, came in frightened accents from the crowd. Hush, Pierre Maxime. The citizen might hear thee, whispered the man who stood closest to the old fisherman. The citizen might hear thee and think that we rebelled. What are these people doing here? Queried Chauvelin as he passed out into the street. They are watching the prison, citizen, replied the sentinel, whom he had thus addressed, lest the female prisoner should attempt to escape. With a satisfied smile, Chauvelin turned toward the town hall, closely surrounded by his escort. The crowd watched him and the soldiers as they quickly disappeared in the gloom, then they resumed the stolid, wearisome vigil of the night. The old Beffroi now told the midnight hour, the one solitary light in the old fort was extinguished, and after that the frowning pile remained dark and still. Chapter 29, The National Fate. Citizens of Boulogne awake. They had not slept, only some of them had fallen into drowsy somnolence, heavy and nerve-wracking, worse indeed than any wakefulness. Within the houses, the women too had kept the tedious vigil, listening for every sound, dreading every bit of news, which the wind might waft in through the small, open windows. If one prisoner escaped, every family in Boulogne would be deprived of the breadwinner. Therefore the women wept, and tried to remember those paters and aves which the tyranny of liberty, fraternity and equality had ordered them to forget. Broken rosaries were fetched out from neglected corners, and knees stiff with endless, thankless toil were bent once more in prayer. O God! Good God! Do not allow that woman to flee. Holy Virgin, Mother of God, make that she should not escape. Some of the women went out in the early dawn to take hot soup and coffee to their men who were watching outside the prison. Has anything been seen? Have ye seen the woman? Which room is she in? Why won't they let us see her? Are you sure she hath not already escaped? Questions and surmises went round in muffled whispers as the steaming cans were passed round. No one had a definite answer to give, although Desire Melon declared that he had, once during the night, caught sight of a woman's face at one of the windows above. But as he could not describe the woman's face, nor locate with any degree of precision the particular window at which she was supposed to have appeared, it was unanimously decided that Desire must have been dreaming. Citizens of Boulogne, awake! The cry came first from the town hall, and therefore from behind the crowd of men and women, whose faces had been so resolutely set for all these past hours towards the gay old prison. They were all awake, but too tired and cramped to move as yet, and to turn in the direction whence arose that cry. Citizens of Boulogne, awake! It was just the voice of Auguste Molieix, the town crier of Boulogne, who, bell in hand, was trudging his way along the Rue d'Aumont, closely followed by two fellows of the municipal guard. Auguste was in the very midst of the sullen crowd before the men even troubled about his presence here, but now with many a vigorous "Allons donc" and "Voyez-moi face donc place voyons," he elbowed his way through the throng. He was neither tired nor cramped. He served the Republic in comfort and ease, and had slept soundly on his palliasse in the little garret allotted to him in the town hall. The crowd parted in silence to allow him to pass. Auguste was lean and powerful. The scanty and meager food, doled out to him by a paternal government, had increased his muscular strength whilst reducing his fat. He had very hard elbows, and soon he managed, by dint of pushing and cursing, to reach the gateway of Gaol. Voyons, enlevez-moi, he commanded in stentorian tones, pointing to the proclamation. The fellows of the municipal guard fell to and tore the parchment away from the door whilst the crowd looked on with stupid amazement. What did it all mean? Then Auguste Molieix turned and faced the men. "Mes enfants," he said, "my little cabbages, wake up. The government of the Republic has decreed that today is to be a day of gaiety and public rejoicings." Gaiety? Public rejoicings, forsooth, when the breadwinner of every family— "Hush, hush, be silent, all of you," quoth Auguste impatiently. "You do not understand. All that is at an end. There is no fear that the woman shall escape. You are all to dance and rejoice. The Scarlet Pimpernel has been captured in Boulogne last night." "Cassier the Scarlet Pimpernel?" "Mais, 'tis that mysterious English adventurer who rescued people from the guillotine." "A hero? Quoi? No, no. Only an English spy, a friend of aristocrats. He would have cared nothing for the breadwinners of Boulogne. He would not have raised a finger to save them." "Who knows?" sighed a feminine voice. "Perhaps he came to Boulogne to help them." "And he has been caught anyway," concluded Auguste Molieix sententiously. "And my little cabbages, remember this, that so great is the pleasure of the all-powerful Committee of Public Safety at this capture, that because he has been caught in Boulogne, therefore Boulogne is to be specially rewarded. Holy Virgin, who'd have thought it? Jeanette, dost not know that there's no Holy Virgin now? And dost know, Auguste, how we are to be rewarded? It is a difficult matter for the human mind to turn very quickly from despair to hope, and the fishermen of Boulogne had not yet grasped the fact that they were to make merry and that thoughts of anxiety must be abandoned for those of gaiety. Auguste Molieix took out a parchment from the capacious pocket of his coat. He put on his most solemn air of officialdom, and pointing with extended forefinger to the parchment, he said, "A general amnesty to all natives of Boulogne who are under arrest at the present moment. A free pardon to all natives of Boulogne who are under sentence of death. Permission to all natives of Boulogne to quit the town with their families, to embark on any vessel they please, in or out of the harbor, and to go whithersoever they choose without passports, formalities, or questions of any kind." Dead silence followed this announcement. Hope was just beginning to crowd anxiety and sullenness out of the way. "Then poor André Legrand will be pardoned," whispered a voice suddenly. "He was to have been guillotined today. And Denise Latour. She was innocent enough, the gentle pigeon. And they'll let poor Abbé Fouquet out of prison too. And François. And poor Félicite, who is blind. L'Abbé would be wise to leave Boulogne with the children. He will too, thou canst be sure of that. It is not good to be a priest just now. Bah, Calatins are best dead than alive." But some in the crowd were silent, others whispered eagerly. "Thinkest thou it would be safer for us to get out of the country whilst we can?" said one of the men in a muffled tone, and clutching nervously at a woman's wrist. It might leak out about that boat we procured for. I was thinking of that. We can go to my Aunt Lebrun in Belgium. Others talked in whispers of England or the new land across the seas. They were those who had something to hide, money received from refugee aristocrats, boats sold to would-be émigrés, information withheld, denunciations shirked. The amnesty would not last long. 'Twas best to be safely out of the way. In the meanwhile, my cabbages, quoth Auguste sententiously, are you not grateful to citizen Robespierre, who has sent this order specially down from Paris? Aye, assented the crowd cheerfully. Hurrah for citizen Robespierre. Vive la République. And you will enjoy yourselves today? That we will. Processions. With music and dancing. Out there, far away beyond the harbor, the gray light of dawn was yielding to the crimson glow of morning. The rain had ceased and heavy slaty clouds parted here and there, displaying glints of delicate turquoise sky, and tiny ethereal vapors in the dim and remote distance of infinity, flecked with touches of rose and gold. The towers and pinnacles of old Boulogne detached themselves one by one from the misty gloom of night. The old bell of the Beffroi told the hour of 6. Soon the massive cupola of Notre Dame was clothed in purple hues, and the gilt cross on St. Joseph threw back across the square a blinding ray of gold. The town sparrows began to twitter, and from far out at sea in the direction of Dunkirk there came the muffled boom of cannon. And remember, my pigeons, admonished Auguste Molière solemnly, that in this order which Robespierre has sent from Paris, it also says that from today onwards Le Bon Dieu has ceased to be. Many faces were turned towards the east just then, for the rising sun, tearing with one gigantic sweep the banks of cloud asunder, now displayed his magnificence in a gorgeous immensity of flaming crimson. The sea, in response, turned to liquid fire beneath the glow, whilst the whole sky was irradiated with the first blush of morning. Le Bon Dieu has ceased to be. There is only one religion in France now, explained Auguste Molière, the religion of reason. We are all citizens. We are all free and all able to think for ourselves. Citizen Robespierre has decreed that there is no good God. Le Bon Dieu was a tyrant and an aristocrat, and like all tyrants and aristocrats he has been deposed. There is no good God, there is no holy virgin and no saints, only reason, who is a goddess and whom we all honor. And the townsfolk of Boulogne, with eyes still fixed on the gorgeous east, shouted with sullen obedience. Hurrah! For the goddess of reason. Hurrah for Robespierre. Only the women, trying to escape the town crier's prying eyes, or the soldiers' stern gaze, hastily crossed themselves behind their husbands' backs, terrified lest Le Bon Dieu had, after all, not altogether ceased to exist at the bidding of citizen Robespierre. Thus the worthy natives of Boulogne, forgetting their anxieties and fears, were ready enough to enjoy the national fate ordained for them by the Committee of Public Safety, in honor of the capture of the Scarlet Pimpernel. They were even willing to accept this new religion which Robespierre had invented, a religion which was only a mockery with an actress to represent its supreme deity. Mais que voulez-vous? Boulogne had long ago ceased to have faith in God. The terrors of the revolution, which culminated in that agonizing watch of last night, had smothered all thoughts of worship and of prayer. The Scarlet Pimpernel must indeed be a dangerous spy that his arrest should cause so much joy in Paris. Even Boulogne had learned by experience that the Committee of Public Safety did not readily give up a prey, once its vulture-like claws had closed upon it. The proportion of condemnations as against acquittals was as 100 to 1. But because this one man was taken, scores today were to be set free. In the evening at a given hour, 7 o'clock, as Auguste Molière, the town crier, understood, the boom of the cannon would be heard, the gates of the town would be opened, the harbor would become a free port. The inhabitants of Boulogne were ready to shout, "Vive the Scarlet Pimpernel!" Whatever he was, hero or spy, he was undoubtedly the primary cause of all their joy. By the time Auguste Molière had cried out the news throughout the town, and pinned the new proclamation of mercy up on every public building, all traces of fatigue and anxiety had vanished. In spite of the fact that wearisome vigils had been kept in every home that night, and that hundreds of men and women had stood about for hours in the vicinity of the gay old fort, no sooner was the joyful news known, than all lassitude was forgotten and everyone set to with a right merry will to make the great fête day a complete success. There is in every native of Normandy, be he peasant or gentleman, an infinite capacity for enjoyment, and at the same time a marvelous faculty for coordinating and systematizing his pleasures. In a trice the surly crowds had vanished. Instead of these, there were groups of gaily visaged men pleasantly chattering outside every eating and drinking place in the town. The national holiday had come upon these people quite unawares, so the early part of it had to be spent in thinking out a satisfactory program for it. Sipping their beer or coffee or munching their cherries à l'eau de vie, the townsfolk of Boulogne, so lately threatened with death, were quietly organizing processions. There was to be a grand muster on the Place de la Seine-Chaussée, then a torchlight and lantern-light march, right round the ramparts, culminating in a gigantic assembly outside the town hall, where the citizen Chauvelin, representing the Committee of Public Safety, would receive an address of welcome from the entire population of Boulogne. The procession was to be in costume. There were to be pierrots and Pierrettes, harlequins and English clowns, aristocrats and goddesses. All day the women and girls were busy contriving travesties of all sorts, and the little tumble-down shops in the Rue de Château and the Rue Frédéric Savage, kept chiefly by Jews and English traders, were ransacked for old bits of finery, and for remnants of costumes, worn in the days when Boulogne was still a gay city and carnivals were held every year. And then, of course, there would be the Goddess of Reason, in her triumphal car. The apotheosis of the new religion, which was to make everybody happy, rich and free. Forgotten were the anxieties of the night, the fears of death, the great and glorious revolution, which for this one day would cease her perpetual demand for the toll of blood. Nothing was remembered save the pleasures and joys of the moment, and at times the name of that Englishman, spy, hero or adventurer, the cause of all this bounty, the Scarlet Pimpernel. Chapter 30, The Procession. The grandfathers of the present generation of Boulognese remembered the great day of the national fete, when all Boulogne, for 24 hours, went crazy with joy. So many families had fathers, brothers, sons, languishing in prison under some charge of treason, real or imaginary. So many had dear ones for whom already the guillotine loomed ahead, that the feast on this memorable day of September 1793 was one of never-to-be-forgotten relief and thanksgiving. The weather all day had been exceptionally fine. After that glorious sunrise, the sky had remained all day clad in its gorgeous mantle of blue and the sun had continued to smile benignly on the many varied doings of this gay little seaport town. When it began to sink slowly towards the west, a few little fluffy clouds appeared on the horizon, and from a distance, although the sky remained clear and blue, the sea looked quite dark and slaty against the brilliance of the firmament. Gradually, as the splendor of the sunset gave place to the delicate purple and gray tints of evening, the little fluffy clouds merged themselves into denser masses, and these too soon became absorbed in the great, billowy banks which the southwesterly wind was blowing seawards. By the time that the last gray streak of dusk vanished in the west, the whole sky looked heavy with clouds, and the evening set in, threatening and dark. But this by no means mitigated the anticipation of pleasure to come. On the contrary, the fast-gathering gloom was hailed with delight, since it would surely help to show off the colored lights of the lanterns, and give additional value to the glow of the torches. Of a truth, 'twas a motley throng which began to assemble on the Place de la Seine-Chaussée, just as the old bell of the Beffroi told the hour of 6. Men, women and children in ragged finery, pierrots with neck frills and flowered faces, hideous masks of impossible beasts roughly besmeared in crude colors. There were gaily colored dominoes, blue, green, pink and purple harlequins combining all the colors of the rainbow in one tight-fitting garment, and columbines with short tarlatan skirts, beneath which peeped bare feet and ankles. There were judges' perukes and soldiers' helmets of past generations, tall Normandy caps adorned with hundreds of streaming ribbons, and powdered headgear which recalled the glories of Versailles. Everything was torn and dirty, the dominoes were in rags, the pierrot frills, mostly made up of paper, already hung in strips over the wearer's shoulders. But what mattered that? The crowd pushed and jolted, shouted and laughed. The girls screamed as the men snatched a kiss here and there from willing or unwilling lips, or stole an arm round a gaily accoutred waist. The spirit of old King Carnival was in the evening air, a spirit just awakened from a long Rip Van Winkle-like sleep. In the center of the place stood the guillotine, grim and gaunt with long thin arms stretched out towards the sky, the last glimmer of waning light striking the triangular knife, there where it was not rusty with stains of blood. For weeks now Madame Guillotine had been much occupied plying her gruesome trade. She now stood there in the gloom, passive and immovable, seeming to wait placidly for the end of this holiday, ready to begin her work again on the morrow. She towered above these merrymakers, hoisted up on the platform whereon many an innocent foot had trodden, the tattered basket beside her, into which many an innocent head had rolled. What cared they tonight for Madame Guillotine and the horrors of which she told? A crowd of pierrots with flowered faces and tattered neck frills had just swarmed up the wooden steps, shouting and laughing, chasing each other round and round on the platform, until one of them lost his footing and fell into the basket, covering himself with bran and staining his clothes with blood. Ah, Vogue la galère. We must be married tonight. And all these people who for weeks past had been staring death and the guillotine in the face, had denounced each other with savage callousness in order to save themselves, or hidden for days in dark cellars to escape apprehension, now laughed and danced and shrieked with gladness in a sudden hysterical outburst of joy. Close beside the guillotine stood the triumphal car of the goddess of reason, the special feature of this great national fete. It was only a rough market cart, painted by an unpracticed hand with bright crimson paint and adorned with huge clusters of autumn-tinted leaves, and the scarlet berries of mountain ash and rowan, culled from the town gardens, or the countryside outside the city walls. In the cart the goddess reclined on a crimson-draped seat, she herself swathed in white, and wearing a gorgeous necklace around her neck. Desiree Candle, a little pale, a little apprehensive of all this noise, had obeyed the final dictates of her taskmaster. She had been the means of bringing the Scarlet Pimpernel to France in vengeance. She was to be honored therefore above every other woman in France. She sat in the car, vaguely thinking over the events of the past few days, whilst watching the throng of rowdy merrymakers seething around her. She thought of the noble-hearted, proud woman whom she had helped to bring from her beautiful English home to sorrow and humiliation in a dank French prison. She thought of the gallant English gentleman with his pleasant voice and courtly, debonair manners. Chauvelin had roughly told her, only this morning, that both were now under arrest as English spies, and that their fate no longer concerned her. Later on the governor of the city had come to tell her that citizen Chauvelin desired her to take part in the procession and the national fete, as the goddess of reason, and that the people of Boulogne were ready to welcome her as such. This had pleased Candle's vanity, and all day, whilst arranging the finery which she meant to wear for the occasion, she had ceased to think of England and of Lady Blakeney. But now, when she arrived on the Place de la Seneschalcie and mounting her car, found herself on a level with the platform of the guillotine, her memory flew back to England, to the lavish hospitality of Blakeney Manor, Marguerite's gentle voice, the pleasing grace of Sir Percy's manners, and she shuddered a little when that cruel glint of evening light caused the knife of the guillotine to glisten from out the gloom. But anon her reflections were suddenly interrupted by loud and prolonged shouts of joy. A whole throng of pierrots had swarmed into the place from every side, carrying lighted torches and tall staves, on which were hung lanterns with many-colored lights. The procession was ready to start. A stentorian voice shouted out in resonant accents, "En avant la grosse caisse." A man now, portly and gorgeous in scarlet and blue, detached himself from out the crowd. His head was hidden beneath the monstrous mask of a cardboard lion, roughly painted in brown and yellow, with crimson for the widely open jaws and the corners of the eyes, to make them seem ferocious and bloodshot. His coat was of bright crimson cloth, with cuts and slashings in it, through which bunches of bright blue paper were made to protrude, in imitation of the costume of medieval times. He had blue stockings on and bright scarlet slippers, and behind him floated a large strip of scarlet flannel, on which moons and suns and stars of gold had been showered in plenty. Upon his portly figure in front he was supporting the big drum, which was securely strapped round his shoulders with tarred cordages, the spoil of some fishing vessel. There was a merciful slit in the jaw of the cardboard lion, through which the portly drummer puffed and spluttered as he shouted lustily, "En avant!" And wielding the heavy drumstick with a powerful arm, he brought it crashing down against the side of the mighty instrument. Hurrah! Hurrah! En avant les trompettes! A fanfare of brass instruments followed, lustily blown by 12 young men in motley coats of green and tall, peaked hats adorned with feathers. The drummer had begun to march, closely followed by the trumpeters. Behind them a bevy of columbines in many-colored tarlatan skirts and hair flying wildly in the breeze, giggling, pushing, exchanging ribald jokes with the men behind, and getting kissed or slapped for their pains. Then the triumphal car of the goddess, with Demoiselle Candle standing straight up in it, a tall gold wand in one hand, the other resting in a mass of scarlet berries. All round the car, helter-skelter, tumbling, pushing, came pierrots and pierrettes, carrying lanterns and harlequins bearing the torches. And after the car the long line of more sober folk, the older fishermen, the women in caps and many-hued skirts, the serious town-folk who had scorned the travesty, yet would not be left out of the procession. They all began to march, to the tune of those noisy brass trumpets which were thundering forth snatches from the newly composed Marseillaise. Above the sky became more heavy with clouds. Anon a few drops of rain began to fall, making the torches sizzle and splutter, and scatter grease and tar around and wetting the lightly covered shoulders of tarlatan-clad columbines. But no one cared. The glow of so much merrymaking kept the blood warm and the skin dry. The flour all came off the pierrots' faces. The blue paper slashings of the drummer-in-chief hung in pulpy lumps against his gorgeous scarlet cloak. The trumpeter's feathers became streaky and bedraggled. But in the name of that good God who had ceased to exist, who in the world or out of it cared if it rained, or thundered and stormed? This was a national holiday, for an English spy was captured, and all natives of Boulogne were free of the guillotine tonight. The revelers were making the circuit of the town, with lanterns fluttering in the wind, and flickering torches held up aloft illumining laughing faces, red with the glow of a drunken joy, young faces that only enjoyed the moment's pleasure, serious ones that withheld a frown at thought of the morrow. The fitful light played on the grotesque masks of beasts and reptiles, on the diamond necklace of a very earthly goddess, on God's glorious spoils from gardens and countryside, on smothered anxiety and repressed cruelty. The crowd had turned its back on the guillotine, and the trumpets now changed the inspiriting tune of the Marseillaise to the ribald vulgarity of the Sierre. Everyone yelled and shouted. Girls with flowing hair produced broomsticks and astride on these, broke from the ranks and danced a mad and obscene saraband, a dance of witches in the weird glow of sizzling torches, to the accompaniment of raucous laughter and of coarse jokes. Thus the procession passed on, a sight to gladden the eyes of those who had desired to smother all thought of the infinite, of eternity and of God in the minds of those to whom they had nothing to offer in return. A threat of death yesterday, misery, starvation and squalor. All the hideousness of a destroying anarchy, that had nothing to give save a national fate, a tinsel goddess, some shallow laughter and momentary intoxication, a travesty of clothes and of religion and a dance on the ashes of the past. And there along the ramparts where the massive walls of the city encircled the frowning prisons of Gaol and the old chateau, dark groups were crouching, huddled together in compact masses, which in the gloom seemed to vibrate with fear. Like hunted quarry seeking for shelter, somber figures flattened themselves in the angles of the dank walls, as the noisy carousers drew nigh. Then as the torches and lanterns detached themselves from out the evening shadows, hand would clutch hand and hearts would beat with agonized suspense, whilst the dark and shapeless forms would try to appear smaller, flatter, less noticeable than before. And when the crowd had passed noisily along, leaving behind it a trail of torn finery, of glittering tinsel and of scarlet berries, when the boom of the big drum and the grating noise of the brass trumpets had somewhat died away, wan faces, pale with anxiety, would peer from out the darkness, and nervous hands would grasp with trembling fingers the small bundles of poor belongings tied up hastily in view of flight. At 7 o'clock, so 'twas said, the cannon would boom from the old Beffroi. The guard would throw open the prison gates, and those who had something or somebody to hide, and those who had a great deal to fear, would be free to go whithersoever they chose. And mothers, sisters, sweethearts stood watching by the gates, for loved ones tonight would be set free, all along of the capture of that English spy, the Scarlet Pimpernel.